When Maya Torres refused the arrogant CEO's condescending $500 tip, she had no idea he'd return 6 months later to discover she now owned the corporation that had just fired him. Before we dive into this incredible story, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story too. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills surrounding Cedar Falls like a gossamer shroud, giving the small Iowa town an ethereal quality that belied the harsh realities faced by many of its 8-0 residents. Main Street stretched for exactly 12 blocks, lined with the kind of mom-and-pop businesses that had somehow survived the economic storms that decimated similar communities across the Midwest. At the heart of it all sat Rosie's Diner, a chrome and red vinyl testament to simpler times, where the coffee was always hot, the pie was always fresh, and everyone knew everyone else's business whether they wanted to or not. Maya Torres pushed through the diner's glass door at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes earlier than her official start time, carrying the weight of exhaustion that had become her constant companion. At 28, she possessed the kind of understated beauty that small-town gossips insisted was being wasted on a life of serving coffee and clearing tables. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her brown eyes held depths that suggested experiences far beyond her years. She moved with efficient grace, her worn sneakers silent against the checkered linoleum as she began her daily ritual of preparation. "Morning, honey," called Rosie Martinez from behind the counter, her weathered hands already working magic with eggs and bacon on the well-seasoned grill. At 64, Rosie had owned the diner for 32 years, and her maternal affection for Maya was evident in every interaction. "Danny, have a good night?" Maya tied her apron with practiced efficiency, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Better than usual. The new medication seems to be helping with the seizures." She didn't mention that the medication cost $847 per month, or that she'd been skipping her own meals to afford it, or that the medical bills from Danny's latest hospital stay sat unopened on her kitchen table like accusations she couldn't answer. The diner filled gradually with its usual morning crowd, farmers grabbing coffee before heading to the fields, retirees who gathered at the corner booth to solve the world's problems over bottomless cups, and the handful of commuters who drove the 45 minutes to Des Moines for better-paying jobs they couldn't find locally. Maya moved between the tables with seamless professionalism, remembering how everyone liked their coffee, asking about grandchildren and crops with genuine interest that masked her own worries. By 9:30, the breakfast rush had subsided, leaving only a few lingering customers and the comfortable hum of small-town conversation. Maya was refilling sugar dispensers when the black Tesla pulled up outside, its sleek lines looking as out of place on Main Street as a spaceship. The vehicle's tinted windows reflected the morning sun with an almost aggressive gleam, and several passers-by paused to stare at the obvious display of wealth. Nathan Cross emerged from the driver's side, his movements sharp and impatient. At 35, he carried himself with the particular brand of arrogance that came from never being told no, never facing a problem that couldn't be solved with money or influence. His charcoal gray suit was perfectly tailored, probably costing more than Maya made in 3 months, and his Italian leather shoes clicked against the sidewalk with the staccato rhythm of someone accustomed to having others adjust their pace to match his. He paused at the diner's entrance, checking his phone with the obsessive attention of someone for whom every minute represented potential profit. Nathan Cross was the founder and CEO of CrossTech Industries, a data management company that had made him worth an estimated $2.3 billion by the age of 30. His success story was the kind featured on magazine covers. The brilliant Stanford dropout who revolutionized cloud storage. The visionary who saw opportunity where others saw only technical obstacles. What the magazines rarely mentioned was his reputation for ruthless business practices and his treatment of anyone he deemed beneath his notice. The bell above the door chimed as Nathan entered, his pale blue eyes scanning the diner's interior with poorly concealed disdain. Everything about the place seemed to offend his aesthetic sensibilities. The worn vinyl booths patched with duct tape, the decades old coffee machine that required percussive maintenance, the handwritten specials board that hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. This was exactly the kind of place he'd escaped when he left his own small hometown in Ohio, the kind of provincial mediocrity he'd spent his adult life rising above. Maya looked up from her task, automatically shifting into customer service mode. "Good morning. Sit anywhere you'd like." Nathan chose a corner booth, sliding across the cracked vinyl with visible reluctance. He pulled out his phone immediately, his fingers flying across the screen as he conducted business that couldn't wait for something as mundane as breakfast. Maya approached with a pot of coffee and a menu, her expression professionally pleasant, despite noting his obvious discomfort with his surroundings. "Coffee?" she asked, already reaching for the cup on the table. "Is it fair trade organic?" Nathan asked, without looking up from his phone, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer would disappoint him. "It's Folgers," Maya replied honestly, maintaining her smile. "But it's fresh." Nathan sighed with the theatrical suffering of someone forced to endure substandard conditions. "Fine, and I need to see a gluten-free menu." Maya's smile remained steady. "We don't have a separate gluten-free menu, but I can tell you what we have that might work. Rosie makes her scrambled eggs with just eggs and butter, and we have fresh fruit." "This is exactly what I expected," Nathan muttered, though whether to Maya or to whoever he was texting remained unclear. "Just bring me whatever passes for food here. I don't really care." Maya took the dismissal with practiced grace, though something flickered behind her eyes. She'd dealt with difficult customers before, but there was something particularly grating about Nathan's assumption that his presence was somehow doing the diner a favor. She placed the order with Rosie, who had been watching the interaction with narrowed eyes. "Charming fellow," Rosie commented dryly, cracking eggs onto the grill with perhaps more force than necessary. "He's having a rough morning," Maya replied diplomatically, though privately she wondered what kind of person couldn't manage basic politeness before 10 a.m. As Nathan waited for his food, he conducted a loud phone conversation about quarterly projections and market penetration, his voice carrying across the diner with the assumption that everyone was fascinated by his business acumen. The other customers exchanged glances, their conversations growing quieter in the face of his oblivious dominance of the space. "The Midwest expansion is crucial," Nathan declared into his phone, gesturing with his free hand as though his invisible audience could see him. "These people need jobs, even if they don't understand technology. We can capitalize on their desperation and get quality work for a fraction of Silicon Valley costs." Maya, delivering coffee to a neighboring table, felt her jaw tighten at his casual dismissal of the hard-working people she knew and respected. Mr. Jameson, retired from the tractor factory, lowered his newspaper slightly. Mrs. Chen, who ran the flower shop with precision that would impress any Fortune 500 CEO, stirred her coffee with deliberate calm. Both had heard Nathan's assessment of their community, and neither appreciated being characterized as desperate. When Maya brought Nathan's breakfast scrambled eggs, wheat toast, and fresh strawberries, barely acknowledged her presence, continuing his phone conversation while picking at the food with obvious reluctance. "The problem with places like this," he said loudly, apparently to his phone companion but clearly intending for the entire diner to hear, "is that people accept mediocrity. They don't aspire to anything better. It's a mindset that holds back the entire economy." Maya set down his check with careful neutrality, though her knuckles were white where she gripped the plastic folder. Rosie, visible through the kitchen window, had stopped cooking entirely to stare at Nathan with an expression that could have frozen hellfire. Nathan finished his call and his meal simultaneously, leaving both his plate and conversation incomplete. He pulled out a leather wallet, thick with credit cards and cash, selecting a $100 bill with the casual indifference of someone for whom such amounts were insignificant. But instead of placing it on the table normally, he made a show of adding 4 more hundreds, fanning them out beside his nearly untouched plate like playing cards. Then, with the deliberate precision of someone staging a performance, Nathan pulled out a gold pen and wrote on the back of his business card, "For someone like you, this probably means more than it does to me. N. Cross, CEO, Crosstech Industries." He placed the card on top of the $500 and stood, brushing imaginary crumbs from his expensive suit. The entire diner had fallen silent, sensing something significant was about to happen, though unsure what form it would take. Maya approached the table to clear his dishes, spotting the money and note immediately. Her face remained composed as she read the message, though something fundamental shifted in her posture. She looked at the bills, then at Nathan, who stood waiting with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he'd just performed an act of charitable magnificence. "Sir?" Maya said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed diner. "Yes," Nathan replied, clearly expecting gratitude. Maya picked up the $500 and the business card, holding them out to him with steady hands. "I believe you forgot these." Nathan looked confused, as though she'd spoken in a foreign language. "No, that's for you. Your tip." "I appreciate the gesture," Maya said, her tone remaining professionally pleasant while something steel-like entered her eyes. "But I work for respect, not pity." The words landed in the sudden silence like stones dropped into still water. Nathan stared at her, apparently unable to process what had just happened. In his world, money solved everything, opened every door, commanded every bow. The idea that someone would refuse it, especially someone he perceived as desperately needing it, challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which he'd built his understanding of human nature. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "You heard me correctly," Maya replied, still holding out the money. "I've served you professionally and courteously despite your behavior. If you're dissatisfied with the service, I'm happy to get my manager. If you're satisfied, then the price is clearly marked on your check. But I don't accept charity disguised as superiority." Nathan's face flushed red, the carefully maintained composure of a billionaire CEO cracking to reveal something much less attractive underneath. "Do you have any idea who I am? Someone who confuses wealth with worth?" Maya answered, her voice never rising above conversational volume. "And someone who apparently believes his money entitles him to look down on hard-working people trying to make an honest living." The diner's other customers had given up any pretense of minding their own business. Mr. Jameson had folded his newspaper entirely. Mrs. Chen had turned in her booth for a better view, and even the usual background chatter of the kitchen had ceased. Rosie stood in the doorway between the kitchen and dining room, her arms crossed, ready to intervene if necessary, but clearly impressed by Maya's handling of the situation. Nathan snatched the money and business card from Maya's outstretched hand, his movements sharp with anger and embarrassment. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice tight with the kind of rage that came from having his worldview challenged. "Someone like you should be grateful for opportunities like this." "Someone like me," Maya repeated thoughtfully, "works 2 jobs to support my disabled brother without complaining, treats everyone with dignity regardless of their bank account, and doesn't need to buy respect from people I consider beneath me." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Perhaps you should consider what kind of person that makes you." Nathan's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound, like a fish gasping for water. He was accustomed to boardrooms where his displeasure could ruin careers, to social circles where his approval was actively courted, to a world where his financial success translated directly into personal authority. Being dressed down by a waitress in a small-town diner was so far outside his experience that he seemed genuinely unable to formulate a response. "This is ridiculous," he finally sputtered, stuffing the money back into his wallet with shaking hands. "You're nobody. This place is nothing. You'll regret this." "The only thing I regret," Maya said with quiet dignity, "is that you'll probably leave here thinking this place and these people confirmed your prejudices, instead of recognizing that you've just seen something you clearly don't understand: integrity." Nathan turned and stalked toward the door, his expensive shoes clicking angrily against the linoleum. He paused at the threshold, looking back as though he might deliver some crushing final word that would put Maya in her place and restore his sense of superiority. But facing the steady gaze of not just Maya, but every customer in the diner, working people who had just watched one of their own refuse to be bought or belittled, he seemed to realize that any further comment would only deepen his humiliation. The door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. Through the glass, the diner's occupants watched as Nathan fumbled with his Tesla's electronic locks, his usually smooth coordination undermined by rage and embarrassment. The car started with barely audible efficiency, and he pulled away from the curb with a kind of aggressive acceleration that suggested a man trying to outrun his own behavior. The silence that followed his departure stretched for several heartbeats before Mr. Jameson began to clap. The sound started slow and deliberate, then was joined by Mrs. Paramax Chen, then by the cook visible through the kitchen window, then by every customer in the diner, until the small space filled with genuine applause. Maya stood beside Nathan's vacated table, her professional smile replaced by something more genuine but also more vulnerable. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was beginning to fade, leaving behind the reality of what had just happened. She had publicly refused $500 money that could have covered Danny's medication for more than half a month, money that could have made a real difference in their daily struggles. That, Rosie declared, emerging fully from the kitchen with her spatula still in hand, was the finest thing I've seen in 32 years of running this place. I probably shouldn't have, Maya began, doubt creeping into her voice as the practical implications settled in. Shouldn't have what? Interrupted Mrs. Chen, turning fully in her booth to face Maya. Stood up for your dignity? Reminded that man that people aren't commodities to be bought? She shook her head firmly. Child, what you just did took more courage than he'll show in his entire lifetime. Mr. Jameson nodded his agreement, refolding his newspaper with satisfaction. Been waiting 40 years to see someone tell one of those types exactly what they needed to hear. Worth the price of breakfast and then some. As the normal rhythm of conversation gradually resumed, Maya cleared Nathan's table with slightly shaking hands. His breakfast sat mostly untouched, the expensive food wasted in the same casual way he wasted respect for others. She scraped the plate and wiped down the table, erasing the physical evidence of the encounter while knowing the memory would linger much longer. At the register, she rang up his abandoned check, $12.47, for eggs, toast, coffee, and fruit. Such a small amount to have triggered such a large confrontation. Maya looked at the numbers on the receipt and couldn't help but smile at the irony. Nathan Cross, billionaire CEO, had been so offended by her refusal of his charity that he'd stormed out without paying for the meal he'd ordered. Rosie, Maya called to her boss. Table 7, left without paying. Rosie glanced at the receipt and waved dismissively. Considerate payment for the entertainment. That man provided more excitement than we've had since the county fair. As the morning progressed toward lunch, Maya found herself replaying the encounter in quiet moments between customers. She thought about Nathan's assumption that money could solve everything, about his casual dismissal of her community as mediocre and desperate, about his fundamental inability to understand why anyone would refuse what he considered generous. But mostly, she thought about the look in his eyes when she'd handed back his money, the genuine shock of someone whose worldview had been challenged for perhaps the first time in years. Nathan Cross had built an empire on the assumption that everyone had a price, that enough money could buy anything: loyalty, respect, silence, submission. Maya's refusal had revealed the poverty of that philosophy in ways his billions couldn't address. What Nathan didn't know, what nobody in Cedar Falls knew, was that Maya Torres had once been offered a very different kind of life. That she'd walked away from MIT and a promising career in computer science to care for Danny after their parents' death. That her understanding of technology and data systems rivaled that of many people working in Silicon Valley. That late at night, after her shifts at the diner ended and Danny was settled, she sat at an old laptop and worked on projects that might one day change the world. Maya had chosen this life deliberately, not because she lacked other options, but because she understood something Nathan Cross had never learned: that true wealth couldn't be measured in dollars, and true success couldn't be bought with other people's desperation. As she served lunch to the factory workers and shop owners who formed the backbone of Cedar Falls, Maya carried herself with quiet satisfaction. She had looked a billionaire in the eye and refused to be diminished by his money or his condescension. She had stood up not just for herself, but for everyone in the diner, who worked hard, lived honestly, and deserved respect, regardless of their bank balance. Nathan Cross had intended to make her feel small with his grand gesture of charity. Instead, he had given her something far more valuable: the opportunity to prove, to herself and to everyone watching, that some things truly couldn't be bought. The lunch crowd came and went, leaving Maya with the familiar satisfaction of honest work well done. As she wiped down tables and refilled salt shakers, she found herself thinking not about the $500 she'd refused, but about the expression on Nathan's face when she'd handed it back. For just a moment, behind the anger and embarrassment, she'd seen something else: confusion. The confusion of a man confronting the possibility that his fundamental assumptions about the world might be wrong. Maya Torres had no way of knowing that this brief encounter would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately transform both their lives in ways neither could imagine. She had no way of knowing that Nathan Cross would leave Cedar Falls that day, carrying more than just wounded pride, but a seed of doubt that would grow into something much larger. All Maya knew was that she had looked into the face of casual cruelty and chosen dignity over dollars, respect over riches. And that choice, made in a small-town diner on an ordinary Tuesday morning, would prove to be anything but ordinary in its consequences. The apartment above Chen's flower shop was silent, except for the gentle hum of Danny's medical equipment and the soft clicking of keys on Maya's ancient ThinkPad. At 11:47 p.m., the rest of Cedar Falls had long since settled into sleep, leaving Maya alone with the blue glow of her laptop screen and the complex algorithms that had consumed her thoughts for the better part of 3 years. Her fingers moved across the worn keyboard with practiced precision, each keystroke representing another small victory in her ongoing battle against what she had come to think of as the fundamental vulnerability of the digital age. The encryption code scrolling across her screen would have been incomprehensible to most people, but to Maya it read like poetry-elegant, purposeful, each function building upon the last to create something beautiful and unbreakable. She paused, rubbing her eyes with the back of her hand, and glanced toward the small bedroom where Danny slept peacefully for the first time in days. The new seizure medication was finally working, allowing him the deep rest that had eluded him for months. Maya saved her progress and leaned back in the second-hand desk chair that had been her workstation for countless nights like this one. The contrast between her current environment and the state-of-the-art computer labs at MIT struck her with familiar poignancy. Instead of rows of powerful workstations and unlimited processing power, she had a laptop older than some of her former classmates' siblings and an internet connection that moved with the leisurely pace of rural infrastructure. But tonight, like every night for the past 3 years, Maya chose to focus not on what she lacked, but on what she was building, something that would have been impossible in any university setting, constrained as they were by academic politics, funding limitations, and the pressure to publish rather than perfect. The memory of MIT came flooding back, as it always did in these quiet hours, triggered by the familiar rhythm of coding and the deep satisfaction of solving problems that existed at the intersection of mathematics and human need. She had been 24 when she walked away from Cambridge, 3 months into her doctoral program in computer science, with a thesis advisor who called her work on quantum-resistant encryption revolutionary and potentially paradigm-shifting. Professor Sarah Cheno, relation to Mrs. Chen downstairs, despite Maya's landlady's insistence that all Chens were probably cousins, somehow had pulled Maya aside after her presentation to the graduate committee that autumn afternoon in 2019. "You're sitting on something extraordinary," the professor had said, her usually reserved demeanor animated with genuine excitement. "The Defense Department has been looking for exactly this kind of breakthrough for years. We could have funding, resources, a full research team." Maya had nodded enthusiastically, her mind already racing ahead to the possibilities. The algorithm she'd been developing addressed what cybersecurity experts considered the looming crisis of quantum computing, the point at which traditional encryption methods would become as obsolete as smoke signals. Her approach combined elements of chaos theory with advanced mathematical concepts that existed more in theoretical frameworks than practical applications. "I want to run some more tests," Maya had told Professor Chen. "Refine the efficiency metrics, maybe explore some alternative implementations." "Of course," the professor had agreed. "Take your time. Brilliance can't be rushed." Maya smiled sadly at the memory. She'd had no way of knowing that she had exactly 36 days left before her world would collapse entirely. The call had come on a Tuesday morning in November, just as Maya was leaving for her advanced algorithms seminar. Danny's voice on the phone had been strange, disconnected, like he was speaking from very far away. "Maya?" he'd said, and something in that single word had made her sink onto her dorm room bed with sudden dread. "What's wrong?" she'd asked, though part of her already knew that whatever Danny was about to tell her would change everything. "There was an accident," he'd said, his voice breaking. "Mom and Dad, they were coming back from visiting Aunt Rosa in Minneapolis. It was snowing, and a truck ran a red light." The rest of the conversation had passed in a blur of impossible words and arrangements that no 24-year-old should have to make. Maya had sat in her small dorm room, surrounded by the accumulated artifacts of academic success, published papers, conference awards, letters of recommendation, and felt them all become irrelevant in the space of a single phone call. She'd driven the 12 hours from Cambridge to Cedar Falls in her ancient Honda Civic, stopping only for gas and coffee, her mind oscillating between disbelief and the crushing weight of responsibility that was settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. Danny had been 18 then, fresh out of high school, and preparing for community college classes that would help him manage the learning disabilities and mild cerebral palsy that had defined his educational experience. The funeral had been a blur of casseroles and condolences, relatives and family friends offering help that somehow never materialized into anything practical. Maya had gone through the motions of grief, while simultaneously trying to understand the financial and legal realities of her new situation. Her parents had been good people, but not wealthy ones. Their life insurance barely covered the funeral costs and outstanding debts. "You could come back to Cambridge," Professor Chen had suggested during one of their phone calls. "Take a leave of absence, get Danny settled somewhere, then return to finish your degree. Your research is too important to abandon." Maya had looked across the small living room of her childhood home, where Danny sat working through physical therapy exercises with the stubborn determination that had carried him through years of challenges most people couldn't imagine facing. The community college classes he'd been planning to take were clearly impossible now. His grief had triggered an increase in his seizures that left him confused and exhausted for days at a time. "I can't leave him," Maya had told her advisor, the words carrying a finality that surprised them both. "Maya, think about what you're giving up." Professor Chen had pressed gently. "Your algorithm could revolutionize cybersecurity. The applications are limitless banking, healthcare, national security. You could change the world." "I am changing the world," Maya had replied quietly, watching Danny struggle with an exercise that had been easy for him just weeks earlier. "Just not the way I planned." The first months in Cedar Falls had been a series of adjustments that felt like small deaths. Maya had sold most of her textbooks to pay for Danny's medical expenses, kept only the essential references and her laptop. She'd found a job at Rosie's Diner because it offered flexible hours and health insurance, and good insurance, but better than nothing. The hardest part hadn't been the work itself, but the assumptions people made about her choices. Former classmates who reached out on social media couldn't understand why she'd abandoned such a promising career. "Couldn't you have found him a care facility?" one had asked with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never faced such decisions. "There are programs for people like that." People like that. Maya had deleted the message without responding, but the phrase had stayed with her, echoing Nathan Cross's dismissive attitude toward people like you. It seemed the world was full of individuals who divided humanity into categories of worthy and unworthy, useful and inconvenient, deserving and dispensable. Danny, for his part, had been heartbroken about disrupting Maya's academic career. "You should go back," he'd insisted during those first difficult months. "I can figure something out." "We'll figure something out together." Maya had corrected him, and gradually they had. The routine they'd established worked because it was built around Danny's needs and limitations rather than trying to force him into a structure designed for neurotypical individuals. Maya worked morning shifts at the diner, came home to help Danny with his physical therapy and life skills practice, then worked evening shifts when possible. The community college had agreed to let Danny audit some classes online, at his own pace, and he'd shown remarkable aptitude for pattern recognition and logical problem-solving despite his other challenges. It was Danny who had first suggested that Maya continue her research independently. "You still think about it," he'd observed one evening, catching her staring thoughtfully at her laptop during a break between dinner and her evening shift. "The encryption stuff." Maya had been surprised by his perceptiveness. She'd thought she'd been better at hiding her intellectual restlessness, the way her mind continued to circle back to theoretical problems even as her hands served coffee and cleared tables. "Sometimes," she'd admitted. "So why don't you work on it?" Danny had asked with the straightforward logic that was one of his greatest strengths. "Not for school, just for you." "I don't have access to the resources I'd need," Maya had explained. "The processing power, the testing environments, the peer review." "But you have the ideas," Danny had interrupted. "And you're smarter than anyone I know. Maybe you don't need all that other stuff." That conversation had planted the seed that grew into Maya's current double life. During the day, she was simply Maya Torres, the competent waitress who remembered everyone's coffee preferences and never complained about difficult customers. But at night, in the quiet hours after Danny's medication had helped him settle into sleep, she became something else entirely. A researcher working on problems that existed at the cutting edge of mathematical theory and practical application. The encryption algorithm she'd been developing at MIT had evolved significantly during her years in Cedar Falls. Working without the pressure of academic deadlines or departmental politics, Maya had been free to pursue theoretical tangents that might have been discouraged in a formal research setting. Her approach to quantum-resistant encryption had become more elegant, more efficient, and significantly more powerful than anything she could have achieved within the constraints of university research. Danny had become an unexpected but invaluable collaborator. His pattern recognition abilities, enhanced rather than hindered by his neurological differences, allowed him to spot inconsistencies and logical gaps that Maya might have missed. He couldn't write code, but he could read it with startling comprehension, offering insights that forced Maya to reconsider fundamental assumptions about her work. "This section here," Danny had said just last week, pointing to a particularly complex function on Maya's screen. "It's doing too much. Like trying to carry too many groceries at once, eventually something's going to drop." Maya had stared at the code, seeing it suddenly through Danny's eyes, and realized he was absolutely right. The function was attempting to handle multiple encryption layers simultaneously, creating potential vulnerabilities that a more targeted attack might exploit. She'd spent the next 2 days refactoring the entire module, resulting in code that was both more secure and more efficient. These moments of collaboration were among Maya's favorites, times when she could see past Danny's disabilities to the brilliant mind that operated according to its own unique logic. He might struggle with tasks that others found simple, but his ability to perceive patterns and connections was genuinely extraordinary. "You know what your code reminds me of?" Danny had said another evening, watching Maya work through a particularly challenging algorithmic problem. "Remember those castles we used to build when we were kids? The ones with all the secret passages and hidden rooms?" Maya had looked up from her laptop, intrigued by the analogy. "Your encryption is like that," Danny had continued, his eyes bright with the enthusiasm that always surfaced when he was working through complex ideas. "It looks like a regular castle from the outside, but inside there are all these hidden pathways that only the right person can find. And even if someone manages to get into one room, they still can't find all the others." The metaphor had been so perfect, so precisely accurate in describing Maya's layered approach to encryption that she'd immediately begun thinking about how to extend it. What if the algorithm didn't just hide data behind mathematical complexity, but created multiple false pathways that would mislead potential attackers while protecting the real information? That insight had led to what Maya now considered her greatest breakthrough, an encryption system that didn't just resist attacks but actively confused them, creating the digital equivalent of a house of mirrors where unauthorized access attempts would become lost in deliberately constructed false leads. The work was intensely solitary, but Maya had never felt lonely during these late-night coding sessions. There was something profoundly satisfying about wrestling with problems that existed at the intersection of pure mathematics and practical necessity, about building something that could potentially protect sensitive information for millions of people around the world. She'd been careful not to publish or share her work through any channels that might attract attention. The last thing she wanted was to find herself pulled back into academic politics or corporate recruitment efforts that would require her to abandon Danny or relocate to places that couldn't provide the specialized care he needed. But sometimes, in the quiet hours after midnight, when her latest breakthrough felt particularly elegant, Maya allowed herself to imagine what might be possible if her work ever found its way into the right hands. Financial institutions struggling with increasingly sophisticated cyber attacks, healthcare systems trying to protect patient privacy in an interconnected world, government agencies responsible for national security who were perpetually one step behind the evolving threats they faced. Her algorithm could revolutionize how sensitive data was protected, making it exponentially more difficult for unauthorized parties to access protected information. In a world where data breaches routinely exposed the personal information of millions of people, Maya's work represented the possibility of digital security that was truly secure. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was developing cutting-edge cybersecurity technology while working a minimum-wage job in a town that most tech companies probably couldn't locate on a map. Sometimes she wondered what Nathan Cross would think if he knew that the woman he'd dismissed as desperate and mediocre was working on problems that his own company's security team probably couldn't solve. But those thoughts were academic indulgences. Maya's real motivation came from a much more personal place: the memory of her parents, who had worked their entire lives without ever achieving the kind of financial security that might have protected them from a single catastrophic event. The determination to build a life for Danny that didn't depend on the charity or pity of others. The belief that intelligence and dedication should be enough to create opportunities regardless of zip code or family circumstances. Maya? Danny's voice came softly from the bedroom, pulling her back to the present. "I'm here," she called back, quickly saving her work and closing the laptop. "Do you need anything?" "Just wanted to make sure you were okay," Danny replied, his words slightly slurred with sleep and medication. "You've been working a lot lately." Maya moved to his doorway, checking the digital monitors that tracked his vital signs through the night. Everything looked stable, but she could see in his expression the worried care that he tried to hide when he thought his medical needs were limiting her life. "I'm fine," she assured him, settling into the chair beside his bed that had become as familiar as her own bedroom. "The code is starting to make sense in new ways. It's exciting." Danny smiled, understanding better than anyone the intellectual passion that drove Maya's late-night work. "Will it help people?" "I think so," Maya said honestly. "I hope so." "Then it's worth doing," Danny declared, with the simple certainty that was one of his most endearing qualities. "Even if nobody ever knows you did it!" As Danny drifted back to sleep, Maya remained in the chair, thinking about his words. He was right, of course. The value of her work didn't depend on recognition or financial reward, but on its potential to protect people who might never know they needed protection. But sitting in the small apartment above the flower shop, watching her brother sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks, Maya allowed herself to imagine a different future. A future where her algorithm found its way into the systems that protected the most vulnerable data in the world. Where the woman Nathan Cross had dismissed as insignificant proved that true innovation could emerge from the most unexpected places. She thought about the conversation at the diner that morning, about Nathan's assumption that money could buy anything, and that people without it were somehow less worthy of respect. His worldview was built on the premise that success was always visible, always quantifiable in terms of salary and status symbols. Maya smiled in the darkness, thinking about the revolutionary encryption code sleeping peacefully on her hard drive, waiting for the right moment to change the world. Nathan Cross had no idea that the woman who'd refused his charity tip possessed intellectual property that could potentially be worth more than his entire company. But that knowledge wasn't the source of Maya's satisfaction. What mattered was the work itself, the gradual construction of something beautiful and useful, built one line of code at a time during the quiet hours when the rest of the world was sleeping. As she finally prepared for bed, Maya reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. She'd given up a prestigious academic career and the recognition that might have come with it. She'd chosen a life of financial uncertainty and professional invisibility. But she'd also chosen to care for someone who needed her, to build something meaningful with her own hands, and to prove that brilliance didn't require the validation of institutions or the approval of people like Nathan Cross. Tomorrow, she would return to the diner, pour coffee and serve breakfast, and smile politely at customers who saw only a small-town waitress. But tonight, in the blue glow of her laptop screen, Maya Torres was exactly who she'd always meant to be, a brilliant woman using her gifts to build a better world, one encrypted bit at a time. The work would continue, patient and persistent, until the day when the world was ready to see what could be accomplished by someone who understood that true value couldn't be measured in dollars, and true security couldn't be bought with other people's desperation. In the quiet apartment above Chen's flower shop, Genius wore work clothes and spoke with the gentle voice of a sister caring for her brother. But Genius it was, nonetheless, preparing to emerge from its small-town cocoon and remind the world that innovation had never been limited by geography, circumstance, or the narrow imagination of those who confused wealth with worth. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday night in March, during one of those late winter storms that reminded Iowa residents why they earned their reputations for resilience. Maya sat hunched over her laptop at 2:17 a.m., the apartment silent except for the steady rhythm of Danny's breathing and the occasional rattle of wind against the windows. She'd been working on the same algorithmic problem for 6 weeks, a stubborn inefficiency in her encryption protocol that had resisted every attempt at optimization. The solution, when it finally revealed itself, was so elegant in its simplicity that Maya actually laughed out loud a sound that seemed startling in the pre-dawn quiet. She'd been approaching the problem like a traditional computer scientist, trying to make the algorithm faster by making it more complex. But the answer lay in the opposite direction, radical simplification that paradoxically created exponentially stronger security. Instead of layering multiple encryption methods on top of each other, like defensive walls, Maya's new approach wove them together in a mathematical dance that was simultaneously beautiful and unbreakable. The metaphor that came to mind was DNA individual elements that seemed simple in isolation but created something infinitely complex when combined according to precise rules. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she implemented the revised algorithm, testing it against every attack scenario she could devise. The results were extraordinary. Encryption that was not only quantum-resistant but actively adaptive, capable of evolving its defensive strategies in real time as threats were detected. It was like creating a digital immune system that grew stronger with each attempted breach. Maya ran the tests again, certain she must have made an error somewhere. But the numbers didn't lie. Her algorithm wasn't just good, it was revolutionary. Processing speeds that made current encryption methods look glacial. Security levels that would require computational power beyond anything currently imagined to break. And most importantly, elegant simplicity that would make implementation across existing systems seamless. She saved her work with trembling hands, backing it up to 3 different encrypted drives with the paranoid care of someone who understood exactly what she'd just created. Then she sat back in her second-hand desk chair and stared at the laptop screen, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. "Maya?" Danny's voice came softly from the bedroom, thick with sleep but concerned. "You okay?" I heard laughing. "I'm fine," Maya called back, surprised to hear the tremor in her own voice. I think I figured something out." Danny appeared in the doorway moments later, moving carefully in the darkness. His seizure medication made him unsteady during the first few minutes after waking, but he'd learned to navigate the apartment even in his disoriented state. "Good figuring out, or frustrating figuring out?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her desk that had become his unofficial workstation during her coding sessions. Maya looked at her brother, seeing the genuine care in his expression despite his own grogginess. For 3 years, Danny had been her only confidant in this work. The only person who understood both the technical challenges and the emotional investment she'd poured into every line of code. "The good kind," she said quietly. "Danny, I think I just built something that could change everything." Over the next hour, Maya walked Danny through the breakthrough, explaining the technical details in terms he could understand and watching his eyes grow wide with comprehension. Despite his learning disabilities, Danny had developed an intuitive grasp of cybersecurity concepts that often surpassed that of trained professionals. "So, it's like having a bodyguard who gets smarter every time someone tries to pick a fight?" Danny asked, his analogy cutting straight to the heart of the algorithm's adaptive capabilities. "Exactly," Maya confirmed, marveling again at her brother's ability to distill complex concepts into perfect metaphors. "And not just smarter, faster, more efficient, more creative in its defensive strategies." Danny was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. "What are you going to do with it?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying weight that Maya was only beginning to understand. For 3 years, her work had been theoretical, an intellectual exercise that existed primarily in the abstract realm of mathematical possibility. But now, with a working prototype that demonstrably outperformed anything currently available, she faced the reality of practical decisions. "I don't know," Maya admitted. "I mean, I know what Professor Chen would say: publish papers, present at conferences, attract institutional funding for further development." "But," Danny prompted, sensing her hesitation. "But that world operates according to rules I'm not sure I want to follow," Maya said, thinking about the academic politics and corporate pressures that had driven her away from MIT. Publishing would mean giving up control, probably giving up ownership. And it would mean leaving here, leaving you. Danny was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a maturity that sometimes surprised Maya. "You know I don't want to hold you back, right? If this thing you built could help people, maybe that's more important than keeping me comfortable." Maya reached over and squeezed Danny's hand, overwhelmed by his selflessness. "It's not about keeping you comfortable, it's about keeping us together. Besides," she added with a small smile, "who says I have to choose between helping people and staying here?" The idea that would become CyberVault Solutions began forming that night, born from Maya's determination to maintain control over her creation while still finding a way to bring it into the world. Over the following days, she researched the cybersecurity industry with the same methodical thoroughness she'd applied to her algorithm development, learning about market needs, competitive landscapes, and the regulatory frameworks that governed data protection. What she discovered was both encouraging and daunting. The demand for advanced encryption technology was enormous and growing daily, driven by increasingly sophisticated cyber threats and expanding digital infrastructure. But the industry was dominated by established players with deep pockets and extensive government connections, making it difficult for newcomers to gain traction. However, Maya also found evidence of widespread dissatisfaction with existing solutions. Security breaches made headlines regularly, often involving systems that were supposedly protected by state-of-the-art encryption. Companies and government agencies were desperately seeking alternatives that could provide genuine security rather than just the appearance of protection. Maya spent 2 weeks crafting a business plan that would allow her to develop her technology commercially while maintaining the flexibility to care for Danny and remain in Cedar Falls. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. CyberVault Solutions would operate as a fully remote company, with Maya serving as CEO and Chief Technology Officer from her small apartment above the flower shop. Finding team members proved surprisingly straightforward. The cybersecurity community was filled with brilliant individuals who valued intellectual challenge over geographic location, many of whom were eager to work on cutting-edge projects outside the constraints of traditional corporate environments. Maya posted carefully worded inquiries on specialized forums, describing the theoretical framework of her approach without revealing specific technical details. The responses were immediate and enthusiastic. Within a week, Maya had assembled a team of 6 remote contractors, 2 experienced developers from Estonia who specialized in cryptographic implementation, a former NSA analyst from Nevada who understood government security requirements, a UI/UX designer from Portland who could make complex security tools accessible to non-technical users, a cybersecurity consultant from Toronto with extensive corporate contacts, and a recent Stanford graduate who brought fresh perspectives on machine learning applications. Maya conducted all interviews via encrypted video calls, her laptop positioned so that candidates saw only a professional backdrop she'd created using a bedsheet and careful lighting. To her new team members, she was simply M. Torres, CEO of an innovative cybersecurity startup. None of them knew that their company's headquarters was a 2-bedroom apartment above a flower shop in rural Iowa. The initial development phase required careful financial planning. Maya had managed to save approximately $18,000 during her 3 years. At the diner money that had been intended for Danny's long-term care needs, but which she now invested in her company with his enthusiastic support. Combined with modest contractor payments and minimal overhead costs, her savings were sufficient to fund the first 6 months of development. Danny became her unofficial chief operations officer, handling scheduling and communication coordination with their remote team while Maya focused on technical development. His pattern recognition abilities proved invaluable for project management, allowing him to spot potential conflicts and inefficiencies before they became problems. "The Estonia team is working during our nighttime," Danny observed after their first week of coordinated development, studying the timeline charts he'd created to track global productivity. "But the Portland designer needs feedback during her morning hours, which is our afternoon. Maybe we should shift some of the feedback cycles to accommodate both time zones better." Maya implemented Danny's suggestions and immediately saw improved workflow efficiency. Her brother might struggle with traditional academic tasks, but his intuitive understanding of complex systems made him an extraordinary logistics coordinator. The first prototype of CyberVault's encryption system was completed in early May, just 2 months after Maya's initial breakthrough. The software represented a careful balance between her revolutionary algorithm and practical implementation requirements, wrapped in an interface that made enterprise-grade security accessible to users with varying technical backgrounds. Testing revealed performance metrics that exceeded Maya's most optimistic projections. Not only did the system provide security levels that current technology couldn't breach, but it did so while actually improving system performance rather than slowing it down. Traditional encryption created processing overhead that users had learned to accept as the price of security. CyberVault's approach eliminated that trade-off entirely. Maya knew she needed real-world validation before approaching potential clients, so she arranged for anonymous penetration testing through contacts her team members had in the white hat hacking community. The results were unprecedented. After 2 weeks of sustained attack attempts by some of the most skilled security researchers in the world, CyberVault's encryption remained completely intact. More importantly, the system had successfully identified and adapted to over 40 different attack methodologies, evolving its defenses in real time and emerging stronger from each attempted breach. It was exactly what Maya had envisioned during those late-night coding sessions, saw a digital immune system that grew more resilient through exposure to threats. Armed with these test results, Maya began reaching out to potential clients through her team's professional networks. Her first approach was to mid-sized financial institutions that were large enough to need sophisticated security but small enough to consider solutions from unknown vendors. The response was immediate and intense. Within 3 days of sending her first inquiry, Maya found herself fielding calls from CTOs and security directors who had heard whispers about revolutionary encryption technology that actually worked as advertised. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit cybersecurity community, and soon Maya was managing a waiting list of companies eager to evaluate CyberVault's systems. The breakthrough client came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Reeves, Maya's former advisor's colleague at MIT, had heard about CyberVault through academic channels and reached out directly. Dr. Reeves now worked as a consultant for defense contractors, helping them evaluate emerging technologies for potential government applications. "I'm not sure who you are or where you came from," Dr. Reeves said during their initial video call, "but what you've built here is exactly what we've been searching for." The Department of Defense has been looking for quantum-resistant encryption that can protect classified communications without compromising operational efficiency. "Your system appears to solve problems we weren't sure could be solved." Maya felt her heart racing as Dr. Reeves outlined the potential contract: implementation of CyberVault's technology across a network of defense contractors responsible for protecting some of the nation's most sensitive military communications. The initial contract value would be $2 million, with potential for expansion to 10 times that amount if the system performed as expected in field tests. There would be extensive security clearance requirements, Dr. Reeves explained. Background checks, facility inspections, the full federal contractor process. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? Maya glanced around her small apartment, where Danny was quietly organizing project timelines on his tablet, while she conducted the most important business call of her life. "Absolutely," she replied, with more confidence than she felt. "CyberVault Solutions maintains the highest security standards in all our operations." The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of paperwork, security interviews, and technical demonstrations. Maya had to be creative about the facility inspection requirement, arranging to rent a small office space in Des Moines for exactly 1 day to serve as CyberVault's primary operations center. Her remote team members played their roles perfectly, appearing via video conference to demonstrate the depth and expertise of her organization. The background check process was more challenging, requiring Maya to explain her career transition from MIT doctoral candidate to cybersecurity entrepreneur. She crafted a narrative that emphasized her determination to develop practical solutions outside traditional academic constraints, without revealing the personal circumstances that had actually driven her choices. Danny proved invaluable during this period, managing the complex logistics of coordinating between government investigators, remote team members, and Maya's continuing responsibilities at the diner. His attention to detail ensured that no contradictions emerged in their carefully constructed professional identity. "The investigator wants to know about your funding sources," Danny reported after fielding a call from the background check team. "I told them you'd bootstrap development using personal savings and initial client payments, which is technically true." Maya smiled at her brother's careful adherence to truthfulness while protecting their privacy. Danny had an instinctive understanding of which details were relevant to share and which were personal matters that exceeded the scope of legitimate inquiry. The contract was finalized on a Thursday afternoon in late June, with Maya electronically signing documents that would transfer $2 million to CyberVault Solutions' newly established business accounts. She stared at the confirmation email for several minutes, unable to quite process the reality of what had just happened. "Danny?" she called softly, her voice barely audible despite her excitement. Her brother appeared immediately, recognizing the tone that meant something significant had occurred. "Did we get it?" Maya turned her laptop screen toward him, displaying the bank notification that confirmed the contract payment had been received. $2 million more money than their family had ever imagined possessing, earned through Maya's intellect and determination rather than luck or inheritance. Danny was quiet for a long moment, reading the screen with the careful attention he gave to all important information. Then he looked up at Maya with an expression of pure pride and joy. "You did it," he said simply. "You actually did it." That evening, Maya worked her final shift at Rosie's diner, though she hadn't yet told anyone about her decision to leave. She moved through the familiar routines, refilling coffee cups, taking orders, clearing tables with a strange sense of disconnection, as though she were watching someone else perform these tasks that had defined her life for 3 years. During a quiet moment between the dinner rush and evening stragglers, Maya approached Rosie at the register. Her boss was reconciling the day's receipts with the methodical care she brought to all aspects of running the diner. "Rosie," Maya said quietly, "I need to talk to you about something." The older woman looked up, immediately noticing something different in Maya's expression. "You're leaving," Rosie said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Maya nodded, surprised by Rosie's perceptiveness. "I got offered another job, better hours, better pay, something that will let me take better care of Danny." Rosie studied Maya's face with the shrewd assessment of someone who had spent decades reading people's motivations and circumstances. "Remote work?" she guessed. "Computer stuff?" Again, Maya nodded, marveling at how much Rosie had apparently observed and understood about her background, despite Maya's efforts to maintain privacy about her technical skills. "Good for you, honey," Rosie said warmly, pulling Maya into an unexpected hug. "I knew you wouldn't be serving coffee forever. You've got too much going on upstairs for that." She tapped her temple meaningfully. "When do you need to start?" "Monday," Maya replied, though in truth, she'd already been working as CyberVault's CEO for months. "I'm sorry for the short notice." "Don't you worry about that," Rosie assured her. "I've been thinking about cutting back my hours anyway. Maybe this is the universe telling me to spend more time with my grandchildren." Maya worked her final hour with careful attention to every detail, memorizing the rhythm of the diner, the faces of regular customers, the comfortable familiarity of a job that had provided stability during the most challenging period of her life. When she hung up her apron for the last time, she felt an unexpected surge of emotion. "Thank you," she told Rosie, meaning far more than just gratitude for employment. "For everything." "You take care of yourself, and that brother of yours?" Rosie replied, pressing an envelope into Maya's hands. "And don't be a stranger. This place will always be here when you want coffee that doesn't taste like office swill." Maya didn't open the envelope until she was back in her apartment. Inside was her final paycheck plus an additional $200 in cash, with a note in Rosie's careful handwriting. "For emergencies. Every working woman needs a backup fund. R." Danny was waiting eagerly for details about her conversation with Rosie, curious about how Maya had handled the transition without revealing the true nature of her new career. "She knew," Maya told him, settling into her desk chair for what felt like the first time in months without the weight of exhaustion from a full day of waitressing. "Somehow she knew I was working on something else." "People pay attention more than we think they do," Danny observed wisely. "Especially people like Rosie who care about others." Over the following days, word spread through Cedar Falls that Maya Torres had found a better job, remote computer work, that would let her take care of Danny while earning decent money. The details remained vague, partly because Maya kept them vague and partly because most residents weren't particularly interested in the specifics of technology work they didn't understand. Mrs. Chen, their landlady, was pleased that Maya's improved financial situation would make the rent more reliable. Mr. Dabley Jameson from the diner mentioned that it was good to see young people staying in town instead of running off to big cities. Even Dr. Dees Morrison, Danny's neurologist, noted approvingly that reduced stress would likely improve Danny's overall health outcomes. None of them had any idea that their small town now housed the CEO of a company that had just signed one of the largest cybersecurity contracts in federal procurement history. Maya made sure to maintain the same modest lifestyle, the same careful spending habits, the same practical approach to daily life that had characterized her waitressing years. The only significant change was the equipment upgrade in their apartment. Maya's ancient ThinkPad was replaced by a powerful workstation capable of handling the computational demands of enterprise-level security development. Danny received a new tablet optimized for his cognitive support applications, along with upgraded medical monitoring equipment that provided more detailed tracking of his neurological status. To outside observers, these purchases could easily be attributed to better health insurance coverage through Maya's new job. The reality that Maya was now personally worth several $1,000,000 and her company was fielding inquiries from Fortune 500 corporations remained completely hidden. Maya found this anonymity both liberating and slightly surreal. During video conferences with defense contractors and multinational corporations, she was M. Torres, CEO of the revolutionary cybersecurity firm that was reshaping industry standards. But at the grocery store and post office, she remained simply Maya, the young woman who took care of her disabled brother and had recently found better work. The contrast became particularly striking during her first encounter with Nathan Cross's technology mentioned in local news coverage. CyberVault had begun attracting attention from technology journalists, who wrote about the mysterious new company that had emerged from nowhere to challenge established players in the cybersecurity market. Some startup called CyberVault is making waves in data protection, mentioned Tom Henderson during one of the coffee shop conversations that passed for local news discussion in Cedar Falls. Supposedly, they've got encryption technology that makes everything else look like toy locks. Maya sipped her coffee purchased at the same convenience store where she'd bought coffee throughout her waitressing career and listened to Tom's second-hand account of industry developments she was directly responsible for creating. "Probably another Silicon Valley flash in the pan," commented Betty Walsh, who ran the hardware store. "These computer companies come and go like summer storms." "Maybe," Maya agreed mildly, "though sometimes innovation comes from unexpected places." As autumn approached, CyberVault's client list expanded to include 3 major financial institutions, 2 healthcare networks, and a telecommunications company responsible for protecting millions of customer communications. Each successful implementation generated additional referrals, creating a growth trajectory that required Maya to expand her team and develop more sophisticated business processes. Danny had officially become CyberVault's Director of Operations, though he continued to work from their apartment and his role remained invisible to their neighbors. His organizational skills and attention to detail proved invaluable as the company scaled beyond Maya's ability to personally manage every aspect of operations. "We're going to need actual office space soon," Danny observed during one of their evening strategy sessions. "Not for meetings, we can still do everything remotely, but for the technical infrastructure. We're outgrowing what we can run from here." Maya nodded, recognizing that her brother was right but reluctant to make changes that would disrupt the life they'd built together. "Maybe something in Des Moines," she suggested. "Close enough that we could drive there when necessary, but far enough away that we can maintain our privacy here." The conversation represented a turning point Maya hadn't fully anticipated. Success was creating its own pressures, requiring decisions that would shape not just her business but their personal life together. For 3 years, Maya had worked toward this moment, the validation of her research, the financial security that would ensure Danny's care, the professional recognition of her contributions to cybersecurity. But now, sitting in their small apartment above Chen's flower shop, surrounded by the artifacts of their modest life in Cedar Falls, Maya realized that success was more complex than she'd imagined. The technology she'd developed during countless late-night coding sessions was changing the world exactly as she'd hoped, protecting sensitive data for millions of people who would never know her name. Yet the most important part of her world remained exactly as it had always been: a small apartment, a brother who needed her care, and a community that valued hard work and genuine kindness over wealth or status. Maya had built an empire from her kitchen table, but she'd done so without losing sight of what actually mattered. As she prepared for bed that night, Maya reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been a waitress serving coffee to arrogant billionaires who assumed her worth could be measured in tip money. Tonight, she was the CEO of a company that those same billionaires would soon need if they wanted to protect their own digital assets. But the victory felt quiet and personal rather than triumphant. Maya had never wanted to prove anything to Nathan Cross or people like him. She'd simply wanted to build something meaningful while caring for the person who mattered most to her. That the rest of the world was finally recognizing the value of her work was gratifying, but it wasn't the source of her satisfaction. True success, Maya had learned, wasn't measured in bank balances or business valuations, but in the alignment between one's values and one's choices. She'd chosen to care for Danny when the world told her to prioritize her career. She'd chosen to continue her research when practical considerations suggested it was impossible. She'd chosen to build her company according to her own principles rather than conventional business wisdom. Each choice had been guided by love and integrity rather than profit or recognition, and somehow those choices had led to both financial success and the preservation of everything she valued most. As Maya drifted off to sleep, she smiled at the elegant irony of it all. The best way to change the world, it turned out, was simply to focus on taking care of the people who needed you most. The transformation happened with the kind of velocity that made Maya question whether she was living through reality or an elaborate dream. 6 months after signing her first major contract, CyberVault Solutions had grown from a kitchen table startup to a company fielding acquisition offers that included commas she'd never imagined seeing in the same sentence as her name. The tipping point had come in early October when Meridian Financial, one of the largest investment banks in the country, suffered a catastrophic data breach that exposed the personal information of 4.7 million clients. The attack had bypassed every layer of their supposedly state-of-the-art security infrastructure, demonstrating with brutal clarity that traditional encryption methods were no longer adequate against evolving cyber threats. Maya had watched the news coverage from her apartment above Chen's flower shop, feeling a complex mixture of sympathy for the affected customers and professional vindication for the technology she'd spent years developing. Danny, monitoring multiple news feeds on his tablet, had looked up from the coverage with the expression he wore when patterns were becoming clear to him. "They're going to call us, aren't they?" he'd said, not really asking a question. Maya had nodded, already composing mental responses to the inquiries she knew would flood their encrypted communication channels within hours. Meridian's breach was exactly the kind of high-profile failure that drove organizations to seek revolutionary solutions rather than incremental improvements. The call had come at 6:23 a.m. the following morning, routing through 3 layers of secure communication before reaching Maya's personal line. Robert Chen, Meridian's chief technology officer, no relation to their landlady. Despite Maya's persistent amusement at the coincidence, spoke with the controlled desperation of someone watching his career disintegrate in real time. "Miss Torres," he'd begun, "I'm going to be direct. We need CyberVault's technology implemented across our entire network infrastructure within 60 days, regardless of cost. This breach is going to destroy us unless we can demonstrate that we've addressed our vulnerabilities with something genuinely revolutionary." Maya had listened to his requirements with growing amazement. Meridian wanted to license CyberVault's encryption technology for their entire global operation, hundreds of servers across multiple continents, protecting trillions of dollars in financial transactions. The proposed contract value was $50 million for the first year alone, with performance bonuses that could double that amount. "I need to discuss this with my team," Maya had replied, though she already knew her answer. "Can we schedule a technical demonstration for your security committee next week?" The Meridian implementation became CyberVault's proving ground for enterprise-scale deployment. Maya's remote team worked around the clock for 6 weeks, developing custom integration protocols that allowed their encryption technology to seamlessly replace Meridian's existing security infrastructure without disrupting daily operations. Danny had insisted on learning the project management software that coordinated their global development efforts, claiming that someone needed to track the human elements while Maya focused on technical challenges. His intuitive understanding of team dynamics proved invaluable as they managed developers across multiple time zones and cultural backgrounds. "The London team is getting frustrated with the Toronto team's code review process," Danny had observed during one of their evening briefings. "Not because the reviews are wrong, but because they're taking too long and making the London developers feel like their work isn't trusted." Maya had adjusted the workflow protocols based on Danny's insights, implementing parallel review processes that maintained quality standards while respecting cultural differences in professional communication styles. The change improved both efficiency and team morale, demonstrating once again that Danny's cognitive differences often translated into superior pattern recognition for complex social systems. The Meridian deployment launched on a Tuesday morning in November, replacing the bank's entire security infrastructure during a carefully orchestrated overnight transition. Maya had spent the previous week in a Des Moines hotel room, the closest she could manage to on-site support while maintaining her privacy monitoring system performance and coordinating with technicians across 3 continents. At 6:47 a.m. Central Time, Robert Chen had called with results that exceeded even Maya's optimistic projections. "Transaction processing is actually 15% faster than before," he'd reported, his voice filled with the relief of someone whose job had just been saved. "Security testing shows vulnerability reduction of over 90%. Ms. Torres, what you've built here isn't just better than what we had, it's better than anything anyone has." Word of Meridian's successful transformation spread through the financial industry, with the speed that characterized all gossip involving money and technology. Within 2 weeks, Maya was fielding inquiries from 6 other major banks, 3 insurance companies, and the Federal Reserve's Technology Assessment Division. Each new client brought challenges that pushed CyberVault's capabilities in different directions. Healthcare organizations needed encryption that protected patient privacy while enabling medical research. Government agencies required security that could adapt to threats they couldn't publicly acknowledge. Telecommunications companies wanted protection for billions of customer communications without degrading service quality. Maya's algorithm proved remarkably adaptable, its fundamental architecture elastic enough to accommodate widely varying requirements while maintaining its core strengths. But success created its own problems. CyberVault's team had grown from 6 contractors to 47 full-time employees, requiring sophisticated management structures that Maya felt unprepared to handle. "We need actual executives," Danny had observed during one of their increasingly complex strategic planning sessions. "People who understand how to run big companies, not just build good technology." Maya had resisted the suggestion initially, reluctant to surrender control over the company she'd built from nothing. But as contract values grew into hundreds of millions and client expectations became correspondingly sophisticated, she'd been forced to acknowledge that her technical brilliance didn't automatically translate into management expertise. The solution had emerged through her MIT network. Professor Chen had recommended David Park, a former Goldman Sachs vice president who specialized in scaling technology companies through rapid growth phases. Dr. Patricia Reeves had suggested Maria Santos, a cybersecurity industry veteran with deep government connections and a reputation for ethical leadership. Both executives had joined CyberVault in January, bringing professional experience that complemented Maya's technical vision while respecting her role as founder and chief technology officer. David handled financial planning and investor relations, while Maria managed client relationships and regulatory compliance. Their first recommendation had been inevitable but painful. CyberVault needed to relocate to a major metropolitan area with better access to talent, infrastructure, and client facilities. Operating from rural Iowa had been charming during the startup phase, but billion-dollar corporations expected physical presence for major contract negotiations. The decision had torn at Maya's heart. Cedar Falls represented everything good about their life: community support, financial stability, the comfortable anonymity that allowed her to focus on work rather than image. More importantly, it was where Danny had established medical relationships and social connections that provided crucial stability for his neurological condition. But Danny, as always, had surprised her with his maturity and insight. "I'll be okay wherever we go," he'd assured her during one of their difficult conversations about relocation. "What I need is for you to be successful and happy. If staying here limits that, then we should move." They'd chosen Minneapolis after extensive research into neurological care facilities and urban environments that might accommodate Danny's needs while providing Maya access to the business infrastructure Cybervault required. The move had been complicated by Maya's determination to maintain the privacy that had protected them throughout their journey. Cybervault's new headquarters occupied 2 floors of a gleaming tower in downtown Minneapolis, complete with state-of-the-art technical facilities and conference rooms designed to impress Fortune 500 executives. But Maya had insisted on maintaining a residential address separate from her business identity, purchasing a modest house in a quiet neighborhood where she could continue caring for Danny without attracting unwanted attention. The transition had been more difficult than Maya had anticipated. Danny's neurological condition had been destabilized by the stress of relocation, resulting in increased seizure frequency that required adjustments to his medication regimen. The specialized care facility Maya had researched so carefully turned out to have philosophical approaches to disability that conflicted with the independence and dignity Danny had always maintained. "They treat me like I'm broken," Danny had complained after his first week in the day program that was supposed to provide social interaction and cognitive stimulation. "Like being different means I can't contribute anything meaningful." Maya had immediately withdrawn Danny from the program, spending 2 weeks researching alternatives before finding a facility that emphasized capability development rather than custodial care. The University of Minnesota's Neurological Rehabilitation Center operated a program for high-functioning adults with cognitive differences, focusing on maximizing independence while providing necessary medical support. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the program director, had understood immediately what Danny needed. "Intelligence doesn't follow conventional patterns," she'd explained during their initial consultation. "Your brother's cognitive profile suggests extraordinary strengths that have been masked by our society's narrow definitions of ability." Under Dr. Walsh's guidance, Danny had thrived in ways that surprised even Maya. The structured environment provided social interaction with peers who shared similar challenges, while cognitive therapy helped him develop strategies for managing the executive function difficulties that had always frustrated him. More importantly, the program connected Danny with volunteer opportunities that utilized his pattern recognition abilities. He began working with the university's computer science department, helping to test accessibility features for software designed to assist people with various cognitive differences. Danny's ability to identify usability problems is remarkable. Dr. Sarah Kim, one of the computer science professors, had told Maya during a family conference, "He sees patterns in user experience that our trained developers miss completely. We'd like to offer him a formal consulting position if he's interested." Watching Danny gain confidence and independence had made the difficult transition worthwhile for Maya. But success continued to create new challenges. Cybervault's valuation had reached $1.2 billion by March, making Maya one of the youngest female billionaires in American history. Financial publications wanted interviews, technology conferences extended speaking invitations, and venture capital firms proposed investment partnerships that would have valued the company at even higher multiples. Maya had declined most of these opportunities, maintaining the privacy that had protected her family throughout their journey. But complete anonymity was becoming impossible as Cybervault's influence grew throughout the cybersecurity industry. The challenge was managing public attention while preserving the values that had guided her work from the beginning. Maya still drove a modest Honda Civic, lived in the same 4-bedroom house she'd purchased upon moving to Minneapolis, and shopped at the same grocery store where other customers had no idea they were sharing aisles with someone worth more than most small countries' GDP. "You know you could buy literally anything you want now," Maria Santos had observed during one of their executive meetings. "Private jets, multiple homes, art collections, the kind of lifestyle that comes with this level of wealth." Maya had smiled at the suggestion. "I already have everything I want. Danny's healthy and safe, our work is protecting millions of people, and we've maintained our privacy. What else would I buy that could improve on that?" The conversation had highlighted one of Maya's most challenging realizations. Wealth beyond a certain point became abstract rather than practical. She could provide excellent medical care for Danny, establish educational scholarships for students facing similar circumstances, and fund research into neurological conditions. But the lifestyle changes that billionaire status enabled held little appeal for someone whose greatest satisfaction came from solving complex problems and caring for her brother. Maya had established a foundation focused on supporting families affected by neurological disabilities, providing both financial assistance and advocacy for more inclusive approaches to cognitive differences. But she'd done so anonymously, through legal structures that protected her identity while ensuring the foundation's effectiveness. The irony of her situation became apparent during industry events where Maya was increasingly expected to appear as CyberVault's public face. Standing in conference centers, surrounded by executives who measured success by net worth and social status, Maya often felt like an anthropologist studying an alien culture. The key to scaling exponentially, proclaimed venture capitalist Jonathan Wright during a panel discussion Maya had reluctantly agreed to join, is understanding that technology companies are ultimately about capturing market share rather than solving problems. Maya had listened to his philosophy with barely concealed dismay, recognizing the attitude that had driven her away from traditional academic and corporate environments. The idea that market dominance was more important than practical benefit represented everything she'd tried to avoid while building CyberVault. "I'd respectfully disagree," Maya had responded during the Q&A session. "Technology companies that focus primarily on market capture rather than user benefit tend to create products that serve shareholders better than customers. Sustainable success comes from building things that actually improve people's lives." The exchange had highlighted Maya's growing reputation as an industry contrarian, someone whose unconventional approaches produced extraordinary results while challenging established wisdom about business strategy and corporate culture. Meanwhile, 600 miles away in New York, Nathan Cross was discovering what it felt like to watch a carefully constructed empire crumble in slow motion. Cross Tech Industries, the cloud storage company that had made him a billionaire by age 30, was hemorrhaging both clients and credibility as cybersecurity failures mounted throughout the year. The first serious breach had occurred in February, when hackers had accessed customer data for over 200 Crosstech users. Nathan's response had been typically dismissive, a brief press release acknowledging a minor security incident that had been quickly resolved with minimal impact. But the incidents had continued with increasing frequency and severity. In April, corporate clients had lost proprietary research data worth an estimated $50 million. In June, a healthcare provider's patient records had been exposed, triggering federal investigations and class action lawsuits. By August, Crosstech was facing potential liability exceeding $400 million, with regulatory agencies threatening to suspend their data handling certifications. Nathan's board of directors had grown increasingly restless as each breach dominated technology news cycles and damaged the company's reputation. Emergency meetings became routine, with outside consultants hired to assess Crosstech's security infrastructure and recommend improvements. "The fundamental architecture is obsolete," concluded Dr. Michael Chen, the cybersecurity expert the board had retained for independent analysis. "Current encryption methods can't protect against the sophisticated attacks we're seeing. You need revolutionary solutions, not evolutionary improvements." Nathan had bristled at the assessment, partly because it implied that his technology decisions had been inadequate, and partly because revolutionary solutions typically meant expensive contracts with unproven vendors. "What kind of revolutionary solutions?" he'd asked, with poorly concealed skepticism. Dr. Chen had pulled out a tablet displaying analysis of recent cybersecurity innovations. "There are a few companies developing genuinely advanced encryption technology. CyberVault Solutions has been getting attention for adaptive algorithms that actually strengthen through exposure to attacks. Their client list includes some of the most security-conscious organizations in the world." The name had meant nothing to Nathan at the time, but he'd made note of it along with several other recommendations. His preference was to solve the security problems through internal development rather than dependence on outside vendors, but the mounting pressure from both his board and regulatory agencies was forcing him to consider alternatives. The catastrophic failure had come in September, during what should have been a routine system update. Hackers had exploited vulnerabilities in Crosstech's update protocols to gain access to the company's core infrastructure, compromising data for over 2.5 million users, including several Fortune 500 corporations that had entrusted their most sensitive information to Crosstech's supposedly secure systems. The breach had made front-page news in both the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, with security experts describing it as a textbook example of how traditional cybersecurity approaches had become inadequate against modern threats. The financial impact was immediate and devastating. Crosstech's stock price dropped 34% in 2 days, major clients terminated their contracts, and federal regulators launched formal investigations into the company's data protection practices. "This is a company-ending crisis," Board Chair Margaret Thompson had announced during the emergency meeting Nathan would later remember as the beginning of the end of his business empire. "We need immediate action to demonstrate that we're capable of protecting client data, or Crosstech won't exist in 6 months." Nathan had spent the following weeks in a desperate search for cybersecurity solutions that could restore confidence in Crosstech's infrastructure. He'd met with representatives from every major security firm, evaluated products from established vendors, and consulted with federal agencies about best practices for data protection. But every conversation had reached the same conclusion. Traditional encryption methods were fundamentally inadequate against the evolving threat landscape. What Crosstech needed was technology that didn't yet exist in mainstream commercial applications. "You need to look at the emerging players," advised former NSA Director James Morrison during a consultation that cost Crosstech $25,000 for 2 hours of conversation. "The companies that are developing quantum-resistant, adaptive encryption. It's expensive and unproven, but it's the only technology that might actually work." Morrison had provided a list of 5 companies working on next-generation cybersecurity solutions. At the top of the list, highlighted and annotated with detailed technical assessments, was CyberVault Solutions. Nathan had stared at the company name, which seemed familiar though he couldn't immediately place why. The technical specifications Morrison provided were impressive enough to be almost unbelievable encryption that grew stronger through attack attempts, processing speeds that improved rather than degraded system performance, security levels that would require computational power beyond current technological capabilities to breach. "CyberVault is the most interesting company in the cybersecurity space right now," Morrison had explained. "They emerged from nowhere 18 months ago and immediately began outperforming technologies that took established companies decades to develop. Their client list reads like a directory of organizations with the highest possible security requirements." Nathan had authorized his technology team to conduct a full evaluation of CyberVault's capabilities, though the process proved more complex than anticipated. The company maintained strict privacy policies that made detailed information difficult to obtain through conventional channels. What his team discovered was both encouraging and humbling. CyberVault's technology represented exactly the kind of breakthrough that could solve Crosstech's security problems while positioning the company as an industry leader in data protection. But implementing such advanced systems would require acknowledging that Crosstech's current infrastructure was fundamentally inadequate, a public admission that would confirm every criticism Nathan had dismissed over the past year. More troubling was CyberVault's apparent selectivity about clients. The company wasn't simply selling technology to anyone with sufficient funding. They were choosing partnerships based on criteria that seemed to prioritize long-term security outcomes over short-term profit maximization. "They turned down Microsoft," reported Jessica Park, Nathan's head of technology development, after weeks of research into CyberVault's business practices. Apparently, Microsoft's proposed implementation didn't meet CyberVault's standards for responsible data protection. The revelation that a relatively new company had rejected one of the world's largest technology corporations suggested either extraordinary confidence or questionable business judgment. Nathan wasn't sure which interpretation worried him more. By November, Crosstech's situation had become desperate enough that pride was no longer a relevant consideration. The company faced potential bankruptcy within 6 months unless they could demonstrate genuine capability to protect client data. Nathan had authorized Jessica to make formal contact with CyberVault Solutions, regardless of cost or implementation complexity. The initial response had been polite but non-committal. CyberVault would consider Crosstech's requirements, but any partnership would need to align with their technical standards and ethical guidelines. They would evaluate Crosstech's current infrastructure and determine whether implementation of their technology was advisable. Advisable? Nathan had repeated when Jessica reported the conversation. We're offering them a contract worth potentially hundreds of millions, and they're questioning whether it's advisable to work with us? Jessica had nodded with the expression of someone delivering news that would not be well received. Apparently, they've had clients whose security culture was inadequate for proper implementation of their technology. They prefer to work with organizations that understand the long-term commitment required for genuine data protection. Nathan had found himself in the unprecedented position of hoping that his company would be deemed worthy of working with a vendor he'd never heard of 18 months earlier. The reversal of power dynamics was disorienting for someone accustomed to having technology companies compete desperately for his business. As December approached, Nathan waited for CyberVault's assessment with the kind of anxiety he hadn't experienced since his early startup days. The difference was that back then he'd been building something new, driven by ambition and possibility. Now he was trying to save something that was systematically falling apart, driven by desperation and the growing realization that his expertise might not be sufficient for the challenges he faced. The irony that escaped Nathan entirely was that the solution to his company's survival might lie with a technology firm led by someone he'd once dismissed as insufficient for his world. Maya Torres, working from her modest house in Minneapolis, while caring for her brother and building a company that was revolutionizing cybersecurity, represented everything Nathan had failed to understand about true innovation and sustainable success. While Nathan struggled to save a company built on conventional assumptions about technology and market dominance, Maya continued to prove that the most powerful solutions often emerged from the most unexpected places, guided by values that prioritized people over profit and long-term benefit over short-term gain. The stage was set for a confrontation that would demonstrate how completely their positions had reversed and how little Nathan Cross had learned about recognizing real value when it appeared in forms that challenged his preconceptions about worth and success. The late November air in Cedar Falls carried the promise of an early winter, with gray clouds hanging low over the rolling Iowa hills, like a ceiling too close to the ground. Nathan Cross sat in his rental car outside what had once been Rosie's Diner, staring at the construction scaffolding and renovation signs with the bewildered expression of someone whose anchor point in reality had suddenly vanished. He'd driven the 6 hours from Chicago on impulse, fleeing a board meeting that had gone so catastrophically wrong. He'd simply walked out rather than endure another minute of thinly veiled accusations about his leadership failures. The idea of returning to Cedar Falls had emerged from desperation rather than nostalgia, one need to find someplace where he could think clearly, away from the relentless pressure of lawyers, investors, and regulators, who seemed determined to dissect every decision he'd made over the past 5 years. But the diner that had represented his most vivid memory of this small town was gone, replaced by a construction site that bore no resemblance to the chrome and vinyl establishment where he'd encountered the waitress, whose name he couldn't quite remember. The woman who had refused his tip with such quiet dignity that the moment still occasionally surfaced in his consciousness at unexpected times. Nathan climbed out of the BMW's Tesla had been repossessed 3 weeks earlier as part of the asset liquidation his attorneys had recommended, and approached the construction site with the careful steps of someone whose world had become fundamentally unreliable. A sign posted near the sidewalk announced that Rosie's Diner was undergoing complete renovation and modernization, thanks to a generous, anonymous benefactor, and would reopen in the spring with enhanced accessibility features and expanded community programming. The language was optimistic in a way that seemed alien to Nathan's current experience, where every piece of news brought fresh evidence of decline and failure. He stood reading the sign repeatedly, trying to process the implications of anonymous generosity in a world where his own experience had taught him that no one did anything without expecting something in return. "Quite a change, isn't it?" said a voice behind him. Nathan turned to find an elderly man with weathered hands and kind eyes, wearing the sort of practical winter coat that suggested a lifetime of Iowa weather. The man's expression was politely curious rather than hostile, though Nathan detected a hint of recognition that made him suddenly self-conscious about his expensive but rumpled clothing. "I'm sorry," Nathan replied, his social skills rusty from months of interactions that had been primarily adversarial. "The diner," the man clarified, gesturing toward the construction site. "Been coming here for morning coffee 37 years, ever since I retired from the tractor factory. Never thought I'd see the day Rosie could afford to close for renovations, much less upgrade everything from the foundation up." Nathan nodded politely, unsure how to respond to small-town conversation that seemed to assume shared investment in local developments. "Do you know who the benefactor is?" The elderly man, his name tag identified him as Harold Jameson, smiled, with the satisfaction of someone who possessed interesting information. "Officially, nobody knows. Anonymous donation through some law firm in Minneapolis. But folks around here have our suspicions." "Oh?" Nathan found himself genuinely curious, despite his preoccupation with his own problems. "Young woman who used to work here," Harold explained, lowering his voice as though sharing a confidence. "Maya Torres. Sweet girl. Took care of her disabled brother after their parents died. Worked double shifts for years, never complained, always treated everyone with respect." He paused, studying Nathan's face with the sharp assessment of someone who had spent decades reading people. "You look familiar. You been through Cedar Falls before?" Nathan felt an unexpected flush of discomfort. "Once, maybe 2 years ago. I don't really remember." Harold's expression suggested he remembered quite well, but he was too polite to press the point. "Anyway, Maya left town about 8 months ago. Got some kind of computer job, remote work. Then, about 6 weeks after she moved away, this renovation project got announced. Coincidence? Maybe, but..." He shrugged meaningfully. "What kind of computer work?" Nathan asked, though he wasn't sure why he cared. "Something with security, I heard. Real high-tech stuff. Sarah Chenchi runs the flower shop, she says. Maya was always too smart for waitressing. Used to see her up all hours working on her laptop after her shifts ended." Harold gestured toward the apartment windows above what had been Chen's flower shop. "Lived right up there. Took care of Danny, that's her brother, while building some kind of business on the side." Nathan stared at the modest apartment windows, trying to reconcile Harold's description with his memory of the unremarkable waitress who had served him coffee and refused his charity. The idea that she had been conducting sophisticated computer work in that small space seemed improbable, like claiming someone had been running a space program from their garage. "She must have done well," Nathan observed, still looking at the renovation site. "Better than well, apparently," Harold said with evident pride. "Danny's at some fancy medical facility now, getting the kind of care he always needed but they could never afford. And Maya." He paused, searching for the right words. "Well, let's just say success looks good on her. Still the same kind person she always was, but now she has the resources to help others too." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a woman in her 60s, bundled against the cold in a practical winter coat that suggested Minnesota winters rather than Iowa ones. She approached Harold with the familiarity of long acquaintance, though Nathan noticed her eyes flick toward him with polite curiosity. "Harold, good to see you," she said warmly. "How's Martha feeling?" "Much better, thanks for asking. Betty, this gentleman was asking about the diner renovation. I was telling him about Maya." Betty, who, Nathan realized, must be Betty Walsh, whom Harold had mentioned running the hardware store, turned her attention to Nathan with increased interest. "You knew Maya?" Nathan found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to explain a connection he'd barely acknowledged and couldn't fully remember. "I may have met her when she was working here. I was passing through town on business." Betty's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, taking on the careful neutrality that small-town residents reserved for outsiders whose motives were unclear. "Maya Torres," she said deliberately, "is one of the finest people you could hope to meet. Works harder than anyone I know, devoted to her brother. Never asked for help, even when she clearly needed it." The emphasis she placed on Maya's name suggested that Betty knew exactly who Nathan was and remembered his previous visit with considerably more clarity than he demonstrated. Nathan felt increasingly uncomfortable under her steady gaze, realizing that his casual dismissal of a brief encounter had apparently made a much stronger impression on the local community than he'd imagined. "She seems to have done very well for herself," Nathan said carefully. "Some might say, it's about time," Betty replied with pointed meaning. "Maya always had more potential than most people bothered to notice. Good thing she didn't let other people's limitations hold her back." Harold, apparently sensing undercurrents in the conversation that he didn't fully understand, attempted to steer towards safer ground. "The whole community's excited about the diner reopening. Rosie's been planning the new menu for months, incorporating some of Maya's grandmother's recipes from when she used to help in the kitchen." Nathan nodded politely while processing the revelation that the waitress he'd barely noticed had apparently been deeply embedded in the community's social fabric in ways that his brief visit had completely failed to recognize. The picture that was emerging of a brilliant woman working multiple jobs while caring for a disabled family member and maintaining the respect and affection of her neighbors bore no resemblance to the person he'd categorized as desperate for his charitable gesture. "Well," he said finally, "it sounds like she's found success. That's good." Betty studied his face with the penetrating assessment of someone trying to determine whether his comment was genuine or merely polite. "Success has a way of finding people who deserve it," she said carefully. "Eventually." Nathan thanked them for the information and retreated to his car, feeling strangely unsettled by the conversation. He'd come to Cedar Falls, seeking the comfort of a familiar place where he could think clearly about his mounting problems, but instead he'd discovered that his memory of the town was based on such superficial observations that it bore little resemblance to reality. As he drove slowly down Main Street, Nathan found himself noticing details that had escaped his attention during his previous visit. The flower shop where Maya had lived looked well-maintained and prosperous. The hardware store displayed a hand-painted sign advertising supporting local innovation since 1952. Even the convenience store where he stopped for coffee showed evidence of recent improvements: fresh paint, updated signage, and a digital payment system that seemed surprisingly sophisticated for such a small town. The clerk, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 20, recognized Nathan's expensive clothing and out-of-state license plates. "You're not from around here," she observed, with friendly curiosity. "Visiting family?" "Just passing through," Nathan replied, though that wasn't entirely accurate. "Nice town." "It's getting better all the time," the woman agreed enthusiastically. "We've had some really positive changes lately. People investing in the community, helping local businesses upgrade, supporting families that need assistance." She handed him his coffee with a smile that suggested genuine civic pride. "It's amazing what happens when successful people remember where they came from." Nathan left the convenience store with the uncomfortable sense that he was missing important context in every conversation. The casual references to community investment and local success stories seemed to assume knowledge he didn't possess, as though there was a parallel narrative about Cedar Falls that existed entirely outside his understanding. His phone rang as he sat in the car, contemplating whether to drive back to Chicago immediately or find a local hotel where he could hide from his problems for another day. The caller ID showed his assistant's number, the third assistant he'd hired this year, after the previous two had quit, rather than endure the increasingly toxic atmosphere at Crosstech's offices. "Mr. Cross," came Jessica's voice, tight with the stress that had characterized all their recent conversations. "The board meeting has been rescheduled for tomorrow morning. Emergency session. Margaret Thompson wants you there at 8 sharp." Nathan closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of dread settle in his chest. What's the crisis this time? Acquisition offer? Jessica replied tersely. "Someone wants to buy Crosstech's remaining assets. The board thinks it might be our best option for avoiding complete bankruptcy." The words hit Nathan like physical blows. 18 months ago, Crosstech had been valued at $2.3 billion, making him one of the youngest billionaires in the technology sector. Now they were discussing asset liquidation and acquisition offers that would likely leave him with a fraction of his former wealth and no control over the company he'd built from nothing. "Who's the buyer?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "CyberVault Solutions," Jessica said. "That cybersecurity company we've been trying to partner with. Apparently they're interested in acquiring our client database and intellectual property, along with our development team." Nathan felt a spark of bitter irony. CyberVault Solutions, the company, whose technology could have saved Crosstech if he'd been able to swallow his pride and acknowledge his infrastructure's inadequacy months earlier. Now they were offering to purchase the wreckage of his empire, probably at a significant discount to its peak valuation. "What kind of offer?" he asked, dreading the answer. "The details are still being negotiated, but initial discussions suggest somewhere in the range of $200 million for everything: assets, intellectual property, staff contracts, client relationships." Jessica paused, letting the implications sink in. "After debt obligations and legal settlements, you'd probably clear about $40 million personally." $40 million. 6 months ago, Nathan would have considered that amount an insult, a fraction of his net worth that wasn't worthy of serious consideration. Now it represented the difference between gradual financial decline and immediate bankruptcy. "Schedule the meeting," Nathan said finally. "I'll be there." As he ended the call, Nathan sat in the parking lot of a convenience store in Cedar Falls, Iowa, contemplating the complete reversal of his fortunes. The technology company that had represented his salvation was now offering to purchase his life's work at salvage prices, and he was in no position to negotiate better terms. The drive back to Chicago passed in a blur of interstate highway and industrial landscape, Nathan's mind oscillating between memories of his peak success and the harsh realities of his current situation. He thought about the early days of Crosstech, when he'd been genuinely excited about the potential to revolutionize data storage and create something meaningful. Somewhere along the way, success had become about market dominance and personal wealth rather than technological innovation, leading him to make decisions based on ego rather than engineering. The board meeting the following morning confirmed Nathan's worst fears about Crosstech's financial situation. Margaret Thompson, the board chair whose patience with Nathan's leadership had evaporated entirely over the past 6 months, presented the acquisition offer with the clinical detachment of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "CyberVault Solutions is offering $200 million for complete acquisition of Crosstech's assets," she announced to the assembled directors. "This includes our client database, all intellectual property, our development facility, and employment contracts for key technical staff." Nathan studied the faces around the conference table, seeing resignation rather than disappointment in their expressions. These were experienced business leaders who had watched Crosstech's decline with growing alarm, and the acquisition offer represented a face-saving exit from what had become an untenable situation. "What about ongoing operations?" asked board member James Hartwell. "Do they intend to maintain Crosstech as a subsidiary or absorb the assets into their existing structure?" Margaret consulted her notes. "CyberVault's representatives indicate they're primarily interested in our client relationships and development team. They have their own infrastructure that significantly outperforms our current systems, so they don't need our technical platforms." The revelation that another company considered Crosstech's infrastructure so inferior that they would discard it entirely was particularly humbling for Nathan, who had spent millions upgrading systems that apparently represented obsolete technology to more sophisticated competitors. "Timeline?" asked Sandra Kim, the board's financial oversight specialist. "They want to complete due diligence within 2 weeks, with closing scheduled for mid-January if all contingencies are satisfied." Margaret looked directly at Nathan. "They've requested a meeting with senior management to discuss transition planning and staff retention." Nathan nodded mechanically, recognizing that his role in these negotiations would be primarily ceremonial. Cybervault was acquiring his company's assets, not seeking his continued involvement in their management. "When do they want to meet?" he asked. "Tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock, Margaret replied. "Their team is flying in from Minneapolis specifically for this negotiation." Nathan spent the remainder of the day in his office, staring out at the Chicago skyline while contemplating the complete transformation of his professional identity. Tomorrow, he would meet with representatives of the company that was offering to purchase the ruins of his empire, and he would have to demonstrate grace and professionalism while negotiating the terms of his own business funeral. The irony that Cybervault Solutions was based in Minneapolis, the same city where Maya Torres had apparently relocated after leaving Cedar Falls, crossed Nathan's mind briefly, but he dismissed it as meaningless coincidence. Minneapolis was a major metropolitan area with a thriving technology sector. It was perfectly logical that multiple successful companies would be headquartered there. That evening, Nathan sat in his downtown Chicago apartment, this fourth relocation in 18 months, as his housing costs were adjusted to match his declining net worth, and tried to prepare mentally for what would likely be the most difficult business meeting of his career. He would need to convince Cybervault's representatives that Crosstech's assets were worth their asking price, while acknowledging that his leadership had proven inadequate to protect those assets. The meeting was scheduled for Cybervault's Chicago office, a sleek facility in one of the city's premier business towers that Nathan had visited months earlier during his desperate search for cybersecurity solutions. At the time, he'd been impressed by the company's obvious success and frustrated by their selective approach to client relationships. Now he was hoping they would find enough value in Crosstech's wreckage to offer him a graceful exit from the technology industry. Nathan arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in his best remaining suit and carrying a briefcase containing financial projections that painted Crosstech's situation in the most optimistic light possible. The Cybervault offices occupied the entire 42nd floor of the building, with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering panoramic views of Lake Michigan, and conference rooms that suggested a company accustomed to hosting Fortune 500 executives. The receptionist, a poised woman in her 30s, checked Nathan's identification against her appointment calendar. "Mr. Cross, welcome to Cybervault Solutions. Ms. Torres will see you in conference room A. Can I offer you coffee or water?" Nathan accepted coffee gratefully, needing caffeine to maintain his composure during what promised to be a challenging negotiation. As the receptionist led him toward the conference room, he found himself wondering about the mysterious Ms. Torres who would be handling Crosstech's acquisition. Cybervault had maintained remarkable privacy regarding their executive team, with minimal public information available about their leadership structure or corporate decision-making processes. Nathan knew that the company had been founded by someone named M. Torres, but details about their background and experience remained elusive despite months of research by his team. "Ms. Torres will be with you momentarily," the receptionist said, showing Nathan into a conference room with a polished mahogany table and leather chairs that spoke of serious money and established success. "Please, make yourself comfortable." Nathan settled into a chair facing the door, spreading his materials across the table and trying to project confidence despite his internal anxiety. In a few minutes, he would meet the person who held the power to determine whether his company died quietly or catastrophically, whether he retained enough wealth to rebuild or faced complete financial ruin. The door opened precisely at 2 o'clock, and Nathan looked up, expecting to see a typical technology executive, probably male, probably in his 40s, probably wearing the sort of expensive, casual clothing that signaled tech industry success. Instead, he found himself staring at Maya Torres. She entered the conference room with the quiet confidence that had characterized her interactions at Rosie's Diner, but now she wore a tailored business suit that complemented her professional demeanor and carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to managing billion-dollar negotiations. Her dark hair was styled in a sophisticated way that emphasized her intelligent eyes, and she moved with the purposeful grace of someone who understood exactly what they were worth. For a moment, Nathan couldn't speak. The cognitive dissonance between his memory of a small-town waitress and the reality of a technology CEO was too significant for his brain to process immediately. He stared at Maya with the expression of someone whose fundamental assumptions about reality had just been proven wrong. Maya, for her part, showed no surprise at seeing Nathan, though something that might have been satisfaction flickered briefly in her eyes before being replaced by professional neutrality. "Mr. Cross," she said calmly, settling into the chair across from him and placing a tablet on the table with practiced efficiency. "Thank you for coming. I trust the drive from Cedar Falls wasn't too difficult?" The casual reference to his recent trip information she shouldn't have possessed unless she'd been monitoring his activities suggested a level of preparation that Nathan found both impressive and unsettling. Maya Torres had clearly done her homework about Crosstech's situation and his personal circumstances. "Ms. Torres," Nathan managed, his voice sounding strained even to his own ears. This is unexpected." Maya smiled with polite professionalism, as though she were meeting any potential business partner rather than someone who had once dismissed her as unworthy of basic respect. "I imagine it is. Shall we discuss the terms of CyberVault's acquisition offer?" Nathan nodded mechanically, though his mind was still struggling to process the complete reversal of their positions. The woman he had tried to buy with charity tips was now in a position to purchase his entire company. The waitress he had deemed insufficient for his world was now operating in business circles that his own failures had placed beyond his reach. As Maya opened her tablet and began outlining CyberVault's acquisition proposal with the clinical precision of someone accustomed to managing complex financial transactions, Nathan realized that he was about to experience firsthand what it meant to be found insufficient by someone who truly understood the difference between wealth and worth. The meeting that followed would prove to be the most educational experience of Nathan Cross's life, though the lessons involved would be considerably more painful than anything he had learned during his years of apparent success. The silence in the conference room stretched between them like a chasm that neither seemed eager to bridge. Nathan stared at Maya with the unblinking intensity of someone trying to reconcile two incompatible versions of reality, while Maya arranged her materials with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. "I believe," Maya said finally, her voice carrying the same measured tone she'd once used to explain daily specials to difficult customers, "that we have some business to discuss." Nathan's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound. The woman sitting across from him bore little resemblance to his memory of the humble waitress who had served him coffee in a small-town diner. Maya Torres, CEO of CyberVault Solutions, commanded the room with an authority that seemed as natural as breathing, her business suit tailored to perfection, and her bearing suggesting someone accustomed to making decisions that affected millions of people. But it was unmistakably the same person who had handed back his $500 tip with quiet dignity, telling him she worked for respect, not pity. The realization was slowly penetrating Nathan's consciousness like cold water seeping through fabric, bringing with it implications that made his chest tighten with something between panic and humiliation. "You," Nathan said finally, the word emerging as barely more than a whisper. "Your CyberVault Solutions." Maya's expression remained professionally neutral, though something that might have been amusement flickered in her dark eyes. "I founded the company, yes. Though I prefer to think of CyberVault as a collaborative effort involving some of the most brilliant minds in cybersecurity." She paused, studying Nathan's face with the clinical interest of a scientist observing an unexpected reaction. "You seem surprised, Mr. Cross." Surprised was a catastrophic understatement. Nathan felt as though the floor had given way beneath his chair, leaving him suspended over an abyss of cognitive dissonance that his mind couldn't navigate. The woman he had dismissed as common and unworthy of his world had built an empire that now dwarfed his own achievements. The waitress he had tried to placate with charity was offering to purchase his company like a distressed asset at auction. "I don't understand," Nathan admitted, his voice carrying a vulnerability he hadn't shown in years of business negotiations. "You were working at a diner. You lived above a flower shop." "You were." He struggled to find words that wouldn't sound insulting, though given their history, diplomatic language seemed somewhat beside the point. Insufficient? Maya suggested helpfully, her tone remaining conversational despite the sharp edge beneath the words. Common? Without the necessary polish? She leaned back in her chair, regarding Nathan with the same steady gaze she'd maintained during their encounter at Rosie's diner. I believe those were your assessments. Nathan flinched visibly at hearing his own words reflected back to him. The casual cruelty he'd displayed that morning seemed even more appalling in retrospect, now that he understood exactly who he'd been dismissing. Maya, I need to explain. That morning I was under a lot of pressure. I didn't mean. You meant exactly what you said, Maya interrupted gently, though her words carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. You looked at a working woman and saw someone beneath your notice, someone whose worth could be measured by your ability to buy her gratitude. You weren't having a bad morning, Mr. Cross. You were revealing your character. The accuracy of her assessment hit Nathan like a physical blow. He wanted to argue, to claim that she was mischaracterizing his behavior or taking his words out of context. But sitting in CyberVault's conference room, surrounded by evidence of Maya's extraordinary success, he found himself confronting the uncomfortable truth that his treatment of her had reflected genuine beliefs about social hierarchy and personal worth. I was wrong, Nathan said finally, the admission seeming to drain something essential from his posture. I was completely wrong about you. Maya nodded with the satisfaction of someone hearing a long overdue acknowledgement. Yes, you were. But not in the way you think. She opened her tablet and displayed a presentation that outlined CyberVault's acquisition proposal with professional precision. You weren't wrong about my circumstances, Mr. Cross. I was indeed a waitress living in a small apartment, working multiple jobs to support my disabled brother. You were wrong about what those circumstances said about my potential. The presentation Maya began displaying was a masterpiece of strategic analysis that would have impressed the most sophisticated Wall Street firms. CyberVault's research into Crosstech's financial situation was extraordinarily thorough, documenting not just the company's obvious problems, but the systemic issues that had led to its decline. Crosstech's fundamental challenge, Maya explained, scrolling through detailed charts that mapped Nathan's company's deteriorating market position, isn't technical incompetence. Your development team includes several genuinely talented engineers. The problem is leadership that prioritized market perception over actual capability. Nathan watched his company's failures dissected with surgical precision, each graph and analysis revealing patterns he'd been too proud or too panicked to acknowledge. Maya's assessment was simultaneously devastating and completely accurate, demonstrating an understanding of business strategy that rivaled the most expensive consultants Nathan had ever hired. Your approach to cybersecurity, Maya continued, focused on marketing sophisticated-sounding solutions rather than developing genuinely effective ones. You sold the appearance of innovation while relying on fundamentally obsolete technology. She paused, meeting Nathan's eyes directly. It's remarkably similar to your approach to human relationships. The parallel she was drawing between his business failures and his personal character was becoming impossible to ignore. Nathan had built Crosstech's reputation on impressive presentations and confident assertions rather than genuine technological advancement, just as he'd tried to establish social dominance through displays of wealth rather than actual respect for others. CyberVault's offer, Maya said, advancing to the next section of her presentation, reflects the realistic value of Crosstech's assets after accounting for liability exposure and market position deterioration. The numbers she displayed were even worse than Nathan had feared. CyberVault was offering $180 million for complete acquisition, $20 million less than Margaret Thompson had indicated during the board meeting. The reduction was explained in detailed footnotes that documented additional legal exposure Nathan's team had apparently failed to identify. This seems low, Nathan protested, though his voice lacked conviction. Our intellectual property alone should be worth more than that. Maya smiled with the polite patience of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow student. Your intellectual property, Mr. Cross, consists primarily of variations on encryption methods that became obsolete 18 months ago. What you're calling innovation, the cybersecurity industry recognizes as technological debt. She advanced to a comparative analysis that showed Crosstech's patents alongside current industry standards, demonstrating with painful clarity how far Nathan's company had fallen behind during his focus on market expansion rather than technical development. However, Maya continued, CyberVault is interested in your client relationships and your development team's potential for retraining. Both represent genuine value that we believe can be preserved through proper management. Nathan found himself in the surreal position of listening to Maya Torres, the woman he'd once tried to dismiss with tip money, explain how she planned to salvage the useful pieces of his life's work while discarding the approaches that had led to his failure. What about ongoing operations? Nathan asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Crosstech as a brand will be discontinued, Maya replied with clinical directness. The name has become associated with security failures and management instability. Your clients will be transitioned to CyberVault's infrastructure, which provides significantly better protection for their data. The revelation that his company's reputation had deteriorated beyond redemption was particularly painful for Nathan, who had spent years cultivating Crosstech's image as an industry leader. Apparently, all that effort had been undone by the reality of inferior technology and inadequate leadership. Maya seemed to recognize his emotional struggle, because her expression softened slightly. Mr. Cross, I want you to understand something important. This acquisition isn't personal revenge. It's a business decision based on market realities and strategic opportunities. It feels personal, Nathan admitted, unable to maintain his professional composure in the face of such complete reversal of their positions. I imagine it does, Maya acknowledged. But that's because you've never learned to separate your business identity from your personal worth. Crosstech's failure doesn't make you worthless as a human being, just as my success doesn't make me inherently superior to others. The distinction she was drawing seemed important, though Nathan wasn't sure he understood its implications. What do you mean? Maya closed her tablet and leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more personal despite the professional setting. 3 years ago, you looked at me and saw someone whose value could be measured by her bank account and employment status. You assumed that because I was serving coffee, I must be intellectually inferior, socially irrelevant, and desperate for your approval. Nathan nodded reluctantly, recognizing the accuracy of her description. But I was never those things, Maya continued. I was a former MIT doctoral candidate who had chosen to prioritize family responsibilities over career advancement. I was developing revolutionary technology while working service jobs to pay for my brother's medical care. I was building something extraordinary from nothing, just not in ways that were visible to people who mistake external markers for actual worth. The lesson was becoming clear, though accepting it required Nathan to confront fundamental assumptions he'd held about success, value, and human dignity. You're saying I missed an opportunity. Maya's smile carried genuine amusement for the first time since the meeting had begun. Mr. Cross, you missed the opportunity of a lifetime. If you had recognized my potential during our first encounter, if you had approached me with respect instead of condescension, you could have been CyberVault's first investor. Your $500 could have bought you equity in what became a $3.2 billion company. The mathematical implications of Maya's statement hit Nathan like a physical blow. Instead of offering her charity, he could have offered partnership. Instead of dismissing her as unworthy of his world, he could have recognized her as someone capable of revolutionizing his industry. His arrogance and superficial judgment had cost him not just social dignity, but potentially the greatest investment opportunity of his career. $3.2 billion, Nathan repeated, his voice hollow with recognition of his massive miscalculation. As of this morning's valuation, Maya confirmed, CyberVault's technology is now protecting sensitive data for 67 major corporations, 43 government agencies, and approximately 200 healthcare systems across 6 countries. Our encryption protocols have prevented an estimated $12 billion in potential cybersecurity damages over the past 18 months. Nathan stared at her, finally beginning to comprehend the true magnitude of what Maya had built. This wasn't just a successful startup or a clever technology company. CyberVault had become essential infrastructure for the digital economy, providing security solutions that other organizations desperately needed but couldn't develop independently. How? Nathan asked, though he wasn't sure if he was asking about the technical achievement or the business success. The same way I managed everything else in my life, Maya replied. By focusing on actual problems rather than perceived status, by prioritizing long-term value over short-term gain, and by understanding that real innovation requires genuine expertise rather than impressive marketing. Maya opened a different section of her presentation, revealing information that had nothing to do with Crosstech's acquisition, but everything to do with the broader implications of their encounter. Since CyberVault's success has provided me with resources beyond my personal needs, Maya said, I've been able to invest in communities and individuals who face challenges similar to those my brother and I experienced. The screen filled with images of a modern community center bearing a small plaque that read, "Anonymously funded for the people of Cedar Falls." Nathan recognized the building's location, occupied the former site of a building's location, end of that occupied the Radivlik/NFO. Vacant lot he'd driven past during his recent visit to the town. The center provides technology training, medical support coordination, and educational resources for families dealing with disabilities, Maya explained. It also houses a satellite program of the University of Iowa's Distance Learning Initiative, allowing local students to access college-level courses without leaving Cedar Falls. Nathan felt a complex mixture of admiration and shame as he processed this information. While he'd been focused on maintaining his lifestyle and social status, Maya had been using her success to address systemic problems that affected real people's lives. There's also this, Maya continued, advancing to a new slide that outlined the Cedar Falls Educational Opportunity Scholarship. Full tuition funding for Iowa students whose family circumstances prevent them from accessing higher education through traditional means. The scholarship program was remarkably comprehensive, covering not just tuition but also living expenses, medical support, and technology access for students who demonstrated academic potential regardless of their economic background. Nathan realized he was looking at the kind of program that could have helped someone like Maya pursue her education without having to choose between academic advancement and family responsibilities. "How many students?" Nathan asked, genuinely curious about the program's scope. 47 so far," Maya replied. "With plans to expand to other states as funding permits, the goal is to ensure that intellectual potential isn't wasted due to economic circumstances or family obligations." Nathan thought about the implications of Maya's philanthropy, how her success was creating opportunities for others who might otherwise remain invisible to people like him. It was an approach to wealth that prioritized social impact over personal aggrandizement, using resources to solve problems rather than simply accumulate status symbols. That's remarkable," Nathan said, meaning it sincerely. "You're changing people's lives. Lives that might otherwise be dismissed as insufficient or unworthy of investment," Maya observed with pointed meaning. "It's amazing what becomes possible when you look past surface appearances to recognize actual potential." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the conference room door. Maya's assistant entered discreetly, carrying a tablet and wearing the efficient expression of someone managing a complex schedule. "Ms. Torres," the assistant said apologetically, "your 3 o'clock call with the Department of Defense has been moved up by 15 minutes. Should I reschedule, or—" Maya glanced at her watch, then at Nathan. "We can wrap up here in the next few minutes. Thank you, Jennifer." As the assistant withdrew, Nathan found himself curious about Maya's government contracts, despite his own predicament. "Department of Defense?" "CyberVault is implementing quantum-resistant encryption across several classified communication networks," Maya explained casually, as though discussing routine software updates rather than national security infrastructure. The technology we developed protects some of the most sensitive information in the federal government. Nathan realized that while he'd been struggling to maintain his commercial client base, Maya had been operating at levels of trust and responsibility that he'd never achieved during his peak success. The scope of her influence extended far beyond the technology sector into areas where failure could have implications for national security. "I suppose I should ask about the acquisition terms," Nathan said, returning reluctantly to the business that had brought him to CyberVault's offices. Maya returned to her presentation's final section, which outlined the proposed transition timeline and employment retention policies. CyberVault will honor all existing employment contracts for Crosstech staff who meet our technical standards and cultural requirements. We're particularly interested in retaining your machine learning specialists and your user experience team. "Cultural requirements?" Nathan asked, though he suspected he understood what Maya meant. CyberVault prioritizes collaborative professionalism and respect for all team members, regardless of their background or role within the organization, Maya explained. "We've found that brilliant technology requires environments where everyone feels valued and heard." Nathan recognized this as a subtle reference to his own management style, which had emphasized hierarchy and individual achievement over collaborative problem-solving. Another lesson in how his approaches to both business and interpersonal relationships had been fundamentally flawed. "The acquisition can close within 30 days, if Crosstech's board accepts our terms," Maya continued. "Your personal compensation will be approximately $42 million after debt obligations and legal settlements." $42 million, a fraction of Nathan's peak net worth, but enough to ensure financial security for the rest of his life. It was simultaneously a devastating reduction in his wealth and an acknowledgement that his failures hadn't completely destroyed everything he'd built. "And after the acquisition?" Nathan asked. "What happens to me?" Maya regarded him thoughtfully, as though weighing her response carefully. "That depends on what you want to happen, Mr. Cross. CyberVault has no interest in retaining your services as an executive, given your demonstrated approach to leadership. But if you're genuinely interested in learning from your mistakes, there might be other possibilities." "Such as?" "I'm establishing a consulting firm that works with technology companies to identify and address cultural and strategic problems before they become critical failures," Maya explained. "Someone with your experience of how not to run a cybersecurity company might provide valuable perspective for other executives facing similar challenges." The offer was simultaneously generous and humbling. Maya was suggesting that Nathan's greatest value lay in serving as a cautionary example, sharing his failures to help others avoid similar mistakes. It wasn't the kind of career resurrection he'd imagined, but it represented a chance to rebuild his professional identity around honesty rather than arrogance. "You'd want me to work for you?" Nathan asked, unable to hide his amazement at the possibility. "I'd want you to work for the principle that business success should create positive value rather than just personal wealth," Maya corrected. "Whether that involves working with CyberVault specifically would depend on your ability to embrace genuine change rather than just strategic repositioning." Nathan understood that Maya was offering him something unprecedented, the opportunity to learn from someone whose success had been built on the values he'd failed to recognize or embrace. It would require admitting that his approaches to business, relationships, and social responsibility had been fundamentally wrong. But it also represented the possibility of rebuilding his career around principles that might actually deserve respect. "I need to think about this," Nathan said finally. Maya nodded, closing her tablet with the efficient motion of someone whose time was carefully managed. "Of course, the acquisition offer remains open for 2 weeks. If you decide you're interested in the consulting opportunity, my assistant can schedule a follow-up conversation." As Maya gathered her materials, Nathan found himself struggling to process the complete transformation of their relationship. 2 hours ago, he'd entered this meeting expecting to negotiate the terms of his company's liquidation with some anonymous corporate executive. Instead, he'd discovered that the woman he'd once dismissed as beneath his notice had become one of the most powerful figures in his industry. "Maya," Nathan said as she prepared to leave, "I need to say something." She paused, regarding him with polite attention. "I was wrong about everything. Nathan continued, his voice carrying a vulnerability that felt foreign but necessary. Not just about you specifically, but about how to judge people's worth, about what success actually means, about my responsibilities to others. He paused, searching for words adequate to express his recognition of how completely his worldview had been proven wrong. I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry for the person I was when we met. Maya studied his face for several moments, apparently evaluating the sincerity of his apology. When she spoke, her voice carried neither triumph nor resentment, but something that might have been cautious hope. "Mr. Cross," she said quietly, "I never needed your apology to know my own worth. But perhaps you needed to offer it to understand yours." She moved toward the door, then paused for one final observation. "I told you 3 years ago that I worked for respect, not pity. I still don't work for pity, Mr. Cross. But I do work for justice, and sometimes justice looks like giving people the chance to become better than they've been, even when they don't deserve it." Maya left Nathan alone in the conference room, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of a city where his influence had once seemed unshakable. Now he sat in the headquarters of a company built by someone he'd dismissed as unworthy, confronting the reality that true worth had nothing to do with bank accounts or social status, and everything to do with how one treated other human beings. Outside, the December afternoon was growing dark, casting long shadows across Lake Michigan and the urban landscape that had once represented the pinnacle of Nathan's ambitions. But for the first time in months, Nathan felt something that might have been hope. Not hope for restored wealth or renewed status, but hope for the possibility of becoming someone worthy of the respect that money couldn't buy and position couldn't demand. Maya Torres had proven that extraordinary achievement was possible for anyone willing to work for it, regardless of their starting circumstances or the opinions of those who considered themselves superior. Her success wasn't just a business triumph, but a demonstration that character, intelligence, and determination were more powerful than privilege, prejudice, or inherited advantage. As Nathan prepared to leave CyberVault's offices and return to a life that would be forever changed by this encounter, he carried with him the most valuable lesson of his career. True worth was measured not by how you treated those above you in society's hierarchy, but by how you treated those you believed to be beneath you. Maya Torres had refused his charity because she'd never needed his approval. But she'd offered him something far more valuable: the opportunity to learn what it meant to deserve respect rather than simply command it. Whether Nathan would prove capable of embracing that opportunity remained to be seen, but for the first time since his empire had begun crumbling, he understood that the most important measure of success had nothing to do with money and everything to do with becoming someone worthy of the kindness others chose to offer. The circle was complete, but the story was just beginning.